The night I first realized my life would never be ordinary began with the wind carrying a scent I could not place. A mixture of wild earth and something sharper, like iron and smoke, drifting through the dense trees surrounding my small cabin at the edge of Hollow Creek, where the shadows moved in ways that did not belong to the wind, and the moon hung low and golden, spilling silver light that made the forest floor shimmer as though it were breathing. I had lived here for years alone by choice, finding comfort in the quiet rhythm of my days, the soft crackle of the hearth, the slow turning of pages in my books, the ritual of coffee in the morning, but even in the calmest routines, there had always been a pulse beneath the ordinary, a whisper at the edge of sleep that spoke to me in dreams too vivid to be mere imagination, dreams of glowing amber eyes watching me through the mist, of hands reaching from darkness I could feel more than see, and a voice calling my name low and resonant as if the forest itself were alive with intent. I had learned to ignore the trembling in my chest and the hair rising on my arms, to chalk it up to the loneliness that had become my companion, but tonight, standing on the porch with the cold seeping into my bones and the fog curling around the gnarled trunks like ghosts, I could not shake the feeling that something or someone was waiting for me to step past the threshold of what I knew, past the fragile barrier between safety and the wild unknown, because the forest had a heartbeat tonight, and it was synchronized with my own, quick and shallow and full of fear and anticipation, and I could hear the distant howl, faint but piercing, slicing through the night like a knife and resonating deep in my chest, and it was not the cry of an ordinary animal, though I had told myself it was for weeks. It was something different, something ancient, full of hunger and mourning and longing all at once, and I felt a pull I could not resist, a tug that made my legs move before my mind could protest, and I found myself following the sound down the winding path that led into the heart of the trees, the leaves wet and cold under my boots, the air thick with the scent of moss and pine, and something wilder that made my skin tingle with both fear and recognition, and I realized as I walked that I had been waiting for this night my entire life without knowing it, that the quiet years had been nothing but preparation, and every book I had read, every lonely evening by the fire, every whispered prayer to a God I barely believed in had been steps leading me here, because the forest seemed to recognize me, calling me deeper into the dark, and in that recognition was an invitation I could not refuse, and as I rounded a bend, the fog thickening and curling like fingers reaching for my face, I saw movement just beyond the moonlight, a shadow that shifted and stretched, taller than any human, and yet moving with the grace of someone who knew every inch of this wild terrain, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat, because the shape was unmistakable in its majesty and its menace, a figure cloaked in black fur that shimmered with the sheen of midnight, eyes glowing gold and watching me with intelligence, with awareness that made the hair on my arms bristle, and I realized I had not imagined the dreams, I had not mistaken the signs, that the stories whispered in the village about the Alpha of the Hollow Creek Pack were not legends to scare children, they were warnings, truths meant to keep people away, and yet here I was standing in the moonlight with my heartbeat echoing in my ears, and the figure took a step forward, and the ground seemed to hum beneath its weight, and I felt a tremor pass through me that was not fear alone but something more primal, a recognition of belonging I did not yet understand, and I wanted to run but my feet refused, rooted to the earth as though the forest itself had claimed me, and the air shifted, carrying a second scent, sweeter, intoxicating, a subtle warmth that wrapped around me and made the hairs on my neck stand on end, and then a sound, soft at first like laughter, yet melodic and musical, the voice of a woman who seemed to belong to the trees themselves, calling my name as if she knew me in ways I could not fathom, and I realized with a jolt that the Alpha was not alone, that the world I had believed to be small and ordinary was vast and secret, alive with rules and rituals older than time, and in the distance, past the shadowed trees and the curling mist, I glimpsed lights faint and dancing like a celebration of some kind, music spilling into the night, drums and laughter and song, and I knew immediately that it was not meant for me, that I was not invited, yet I could not look away because something in the way the forest moved, in the way the Alpha watched me, in the way the scent and the sounds wrapped around me, told me that the world I had been hiding in was over, that my ordinary life had ended the moment I stepped onto this path, and that whatever waited at the heart of the Hollow Creek woods would change me forever. And as the shadow shifted again, the Alpha's eyes locking onto mine, and the laughter of the unseen woman rose, full of teasing and promise, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was utterly, irrevocably alone, yet not alone at all, and the forest exhaled around me, the fog thickening, the leaves rustling with secrets, And I knew that I had crossed a line I could never return from, because the moment had arrived, the moment I would either embrace my destiny or lose myself to the night forever. And as I took a hesitant step forward, the gold eyes blinked slowly, knowingly, and the voice whispered again, closer now, and I shivered, not from cold, but from the awareness that something beyond understanding had claimed me, and whatever came next would not just test my courage, it would demand the deepest parts of my heart. And the first howl echoed again, louder this time, and the shadow advanced, and I realized that I had finally arrived where I had always belonged, yet feared the most, and the last thing I saw before the darkness fully enveloped me was the Alpha's gaze, unwavering, powerful, and alive with a promise that sent a shiver down my spine and made my pulse race, because I knew instinctively that this was only the beginning. The morning after I first saw the shadow in the woods, I woke to a forest that felt both familiar and alien, the sun spilling gold across the mossy ground, but the air heavy with a tension I could not name, and even the birds seemed hesitant, their chirps fractured and uncertain, as though the world itself held its breath, and I noticed immediately that the path I had walked the night before bore no trace of my footsteps, only the faint impression of something larger, something deliberate, moving with purpose, and I felt a shiver of both fear and fascination run through me as I tried to shake off the memory of the golden eyes and the melody of the woman's laughter. Yet the images lingered in my mind, vivid and insistent, crawling into my thoughts like the first tendrils of a storm I could not escape, and as I moved through my small cabin, the mundane acts of making coffee and lighting the fire felt hollow, as though the objects around me had lost their weight, their meaning, and even the sun that warmed my skin could not chase away the shadow that had settled over my heart. And it was in the quiet of that morning that I first heard it, faint and almost imperceptible, a rustle behind the cabin like footsteps on the leaves, soft and deliberate. Yet I knew I was alone, at least in the way I had always understood being alone, and the hairs on my arms rose as a cold wave slid down my spine, making my heartbeat quicken in warning. And when I stepped outside, the forest seemed to shift around me, the trees bending slightly as though in acknowledgement, the branches brushing together to create whispers that sounded almost like words, a language I did not know but somehow understood in the marrow of my bones, and every instinct screamed that I should retreat, that I should run back into the warmth of my cabin and lock the doors, but something held me rooted, a curiosity mingled with fear that drew me deeper into the edges of the woods, where the mist clung to the ground in thick ribbons and the sunlight barely penetrated, leaving the shadows heavy and alive. And as I walked, I noticed the changes that had already begun. The underbrush trampled in ways I did not recognize, the air thick with scents I could not name, a mix of wet earth, pine, and something metallic that made my stomach twist, and the whispers continued, rising and falling with the wind, sometimes seeming to circle me, sometimes seeming to watch from above, and I realized I was not imagining it, that something unseen was moving with me, studying me, testing me, and I felt a thrill I did not want to admit, because it mingled too closely with a fear that was sharper, more urgent, and more demanding than anything I had ever known. And when I returned to the cabin to find my small breakfast untouched, my coffee growing cold, I noticed marks on the ground near the door, tiny clawed impressions, careful and deliberate, and I froze, knowing they could not belong to any ordinary creature. And yet when I called out, the forest answered with silence, the weight of it pressing in on me, a quiet that was anything but peaceful, a quiet that seemed to promise that the shadows were watching, waiting, and the sensation of being observed only intensified when I glimpsed movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees with a fluid grace, faster than anything human could manage, and I turned, heart hammering, to find nothing, only the wind stirring the leaves and the sunlight glinting on the dew. Yet the impression of eyes lingered, golden, intelligent and piercing, as if the memory of the night before had left a mark on the world itself, a mark that would not fade. And I found myself questioning everything I had taken for granted, the safety of my cabin, the solitude I had prized, the belief that my world was simple, that the rules of ordinary life still applied to me, because the forest was shifting, alive with secrets I could not name. And the feeling followed me into the day, creeping into mundane moments, into the chopping of firewood and the sweep of the floor, into the way the sunlight fell across the table, casting patterns that seemed to twist into shapes that watched me. And I could not explain why I felt the pull, the persistent tug at the edges of my mind, the way the whisper seemed to echo in my thoughts, urging me toward the trees even when every rational thought screamed that I should stay away. And then there were the sounds that came at night, faint and irregular, the brush of claws on the forest floor, the soft murmur of voices that could have been the wind, the rustle of something large moving just beyond the edge of vision. And every time I reached the window to see, I caught only glimpses, a flicker of black fur, a flash of golden eyes, a shadow that vanished before I could fully grasp it, and I began to wonder if I was losing my mind, if the isolation had finally warped my perception. Yet the awareness that the alpha and his pack might be near, that the forest was no longer a passive backdrop to my life but an active participant, made my heart race with both dread and fascination. And when I heard laughter one evening, soft and musical, carried on the wind like a thread of silk, I froze, recognizing it instantly as the same voice from the night I had first glimpsed the shadow. And the sound wrapped around me, teasing, knowing, drawing me into the darkness beyond the porch light. And I felt a pulse in the earth beneath my feet, steady and strong, and I realized that my ordinary life, the one I had cherished, was slipping through my fingers, dissolving into something ancient and dangerous. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw the amber gaze of the alpha, felt the presence of the unseen pack pressing just beyond my vision, and the laughter of the woman who seemed both part of the forest and apart from it teased at my soul, a mixture of promise and warning that I could not shake. And I found that I could not sleep, that the shadows clung to me even in the brightest sun, that every sound became a signal, every movement a message, and the forest seemed to pulse with life that responded to me, that reacted to me, that might even be calling me. And as night fell, heavy and close, bringing with it the mist that curled around the cabin like spectral fingers, I felt an unease that I could not name but that lodged itself deep in my chest, a premonition that the ordinary world I had trusted was gone, that my life was poised on the edge of something that would demand courage I did not yet know I possessed. And in the distance, just beyond the fog, I thought I saw shapes moving, blurred and shifting, watching, waiting, reminding me that my solitude was an illusion, that the shadows held secrets that would soon collide with my life. And as I climbed into bed, heart hammering and mind racing, the forest whispering at the edges of my consciousness, I understood with a sinking certainty that nothing in my life would ever feel safe again. And the unease, subtle yet insistent, wrapped around me like a second skin, ready to grow, ready to consume. And I lay awake, listening to the night, knowing that whatever had begun in the woods was only the first ripple of a storm I could not yet see but that would soon crash into everything I believed, leaving my world unrecognizable. The days after the unease began were filled with subtle disturbances, the kind that make the air thick with anticipation and turn ordinary moments into tests of nerves. Because it started in small ways that I could almost ignore, a bird landing on my windowsill and staring at me with an intelligence that felt wrong, a rustling in the underbrush that paused the instant I turned my head, a fox lingering too long near the edge of my clearing as if it were trying to deliver a message I could not understand. And then one morning, I found a note tucked beneath a stone at the edge of my porch, its edges worn and damp from the night air, the handwriting jagged and hurried, the words scrawled in black ink that had bled slightly into the paper, and it simply said, "Do not trust the eyes that watch from the dark." And I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, feeling the pulse of urgency that seeped into my veins, and I knew instinctively that it was meant for me, meant to warn me of something I had not yet seen, of dangers lurking closer than I could imagine. And as I looked around, the forest seemed to lean toward me, the branches bending in shapes that suggested movement, shapes that were not leaves but the outlines of forms I could not name. And my mind raced to interpret what I had been ignoring, the subtle signs that had been growing over the past days, the way the shadows seemed to linger, the way the wind shifted just as I moved, the way every living thing watched and waited. And then I went into town, hoping that the presence of people and mundane routine would ease the tightness in my chest. But even there, I found no relief because the whispers began immediately, low voices that faded when I turned my head, but that carried meaning in their timbre. And at the general store, an elderly woman with hands knotted like tree roots leaned toward me while pretending to tie her apron, her eyes sharp and knowing, and she said in a voice only meant for me, "You should not go near the woods when the moon is high, the pack has eyes everywhere." And before I could respond, she straightened, her smile polite but cold, and I realized she had said more than she meant to, that there were layers of warning in every word, that my presence had already drawn attention I could not yet comprehend, and I felt the hairs on my arms bristle, a mixture of fear and fascination, because I understood that the world I had thought I knew was filled with people who saw things I could not, who knew rules I was only beginning to sense. And when I returned home, the forest seemed to respond to the tension, the leaves twisting unnaturally in the wind, the branches scratching against each other in a rhythm that sounded almost like whispers themselves. And then as twilight approached, I saw movement in the distance, a flicker at the edge of the clearing, something that darted between the trees, sleek and purposeful, too fast for me to identify, and I sensed, with the kind of certainty that made my chest tighten, that it was observing me, testing me, marking me, and I remembered the note, the old woman's warning, and the intelligence in the fox's gaze, and I realized the forest itself was communicating with me, through animals, through shapes, through sounds that only my heightened awareness could detect, and the unease coiled tighter in my stomach, because it was no longer a subtle whisper, it was a growing drumbeat, a rhythm of anticipation that demanded my attention, that made every shadow in my cabin seem to shift with intent, that made the wind through the broken windowpane sound like voices warning me to look, to watch, to notice, to prepare. And then came the first sign of something I could not yet name, a series of scratches along the base of the cabin door, shallow, precise, deliberate, as if claws had traced a warning, and the marks glimmered faintly in the dying light, making me step back, heart hammering, breath uneven, and I thought of the alpha, of the golden eyes that had watched me from the night before, of the laughter of the woman who belonged to the shadows, and I wondered if the marks were theirs, if the forest itself had reached out to make sure I understood that I was no longer alone, that my every movement, every thought, every hesitation had been observed and catalogued by beings far more aware of me than I was of them, and I felt a strange mixture of awe and terror, because the boundaries I had always trusted, between human and wild, between safety and danger, between ordinary life and the supernatural, were dissolving faster than I could comprehend, and when I stepped into the trees that night, following the faint trail of scents and impressions I had begun to notice, I found the forest had become a maze of signs, of subtle disturbances that I had learned to read like a language, and everywhere I turned, there were indicators that I could not yet fully decipher. A pile of leaves disturbed into a pattern, the faintest outline of footprints that did not match any animal I had ever seen, the whispering of the wind that carried the faintest echo of voices, words I could not quite grasp, and I realized that every night would bring more of these signs, that the forest was speaking to me in ways that demanded vigilance and courage, and yet it was not all warning, there was an invitation in the air, a promise that I did not understand but felt in my chest, a tension between danger and allure that made my pulse quicken and my thoughts spin with questions I could not answer, and then as I returned to the cabin under a moon that hung full and swollen, I saw a flash of movement at the edge of the clearing, golden eyes that glowed with intelligence and intent, watching me, waiting for something, and I froze, realizing that the warnings were not idle, that the cryptic note, the behavior of the animals, the whispers in town, and the scratches on my door were all connected, forming a network of signals I had no choice but to heed. And in that moment I understood that suspicion was no longer a thought but a state of being, that every sound, every shadow, every unexpected movement held a message, and that my ordinary life, the life I had clung to, was dissolving into something both beautiful and terrifying. And as the wind stirred the leaves and the moonlight glinted off the forest floor, I felt the weight of being watched, tested, and perhaps chosen, and I lay awake that night, heart racing, mind whirling, listening to whispers that may or may not have been real, understanding with a deep sinking certainty that nothing in the world I knew could prepare me for what was coming, and that the unease that had begun as a ripple in my thoughts was growing into a tide I could no longer ignore, one that would pull me deeper into the darkness, into the forest, into the waiting eyes and the secrets that had already claimed me. The night I first saw him, or what I could only call him, the forest seemed alive in a way that made every nerve in my body tingle, the fog thick and curling like fingers around the trunks of the trees, the moonlight spilling silver across the damp leaves, and I was walking carefully, senses stretched, listening to the whispers of the wind and the distant cry of some nocturnal creature, when movement caught my eye, a shadow among the shadows, impossible to define, shifting with an almost predatory grace that made my pulse pound and my stomach tighten with a combination of fear and fascination, and I stopped, frozen mid-step, my breath misting in the cold night air, because the figure was tall, impossibly so, moving with a fluid confidence that seemed inhuman, the fur glinting black under the moon, every movement calculated, controlled, yet the presence was magnetic, drawing my gaze even as my instincts screamed to look away, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that my eyes were playing tricks after days of unease, but the rustle of leaves and the snap of a twig nearby told me otherwise, that something was out there, watching, testing, waiting, and I felt the pull in my chest, a gravity I could not resist, a tension that made my knees weak and my fingers curl into the folds of my coat as though holding on to reality itself, and I realized that even standing in the light of the moon, I felt naked and exposed, as if the forest, the shadows, and this presence had already stripped away the safety I had clung to, leaving only raw perception and heightened senses that made every sound, every movement, every breath, amplified and urgent. And then, without warning, the shadow moved again, a flicker at the edge of my vision, closer this time, but still just out of reach, and I caught a glimpse of eyes, gold and luminous, intelligent and alive, watching me with an intensity that made my heart stutter, and I had no choice but to stare, drawn as though by some ancient tether I did not understand, because it felt personal, directed, deliberate, as though the world had shifted its orbit just to bring us here together in this fleeting, suspended moment, and the magnetic pull of that gaze reached deep into my chest, stirring a longing I had never known, a curiosity that made every instinct contradict itself, part of me screaming to flee, part of me aching to step closer, to see, to know, to understand. And as I watched, the shadow retreated just a few steps, moving among the trees with silence and precision that no human could replicate, and I could feel the weight of his presence lingering, pressing against my senses, the forest seeming to hum in resonance with him, the leaves rustling as if whispering his name in a tongue I could not comprehend, and I felt both fear and awe, my mind struggling to reconcile the ordinary with the extraordinary, the rational with the impossible, and I realized that the pull was not merely physical, but emotional, magnetic in a way that seemed to bypass thought entirely, striking at the very core of my being, and the tension made me shiver, not from cold, but from the raw, unnerving power of it, a recognition I did not understand, a connection that was instinctive and unavoidable, and I knew without thinking that this was no ordinary encounter, that this shadow, this presence, had been watching me long before I even stepped onto this path, that my life, my routines, my solitude, had all led me to this night, to this single fleeting glimpse that left me unsettled and curious in equal measure, and I could feel the echo of his gaze long after he disappeared into the blackened trees, leaving only the memory of gold eyes burning in my mind, the sensation of something alive and deliberate brushing against my awareness, and I found myself walking in circles through the clearing, heart racing, ears straining, every sense alert for a sign that he would return, that the forest itself might reveal him again, because it had changed, the shadows now seeming thicker, more deliberate, as if aware of me, as if expecting something, and I could feel the rhythm of the earth beneath my feet, a pulse that matched the quickening of my own heartbeat, and every instinct I had sharpened, alerting me that the ordinary boundaries of the world were gone, that reality had become fluid, and that this figure, this alpha presence that I could not yet define, was altering everything around me with a subtle power that left my mind spinning, unable to place fear or fascination above the other, unable to decide whether to run or to surrender to the pull. And then, as I reached the far edge of the clearing, I noticed movement among the underbrush, smaller shapes moving with intent, the soft padding of paws too light for their size, too coordinated for ordinary animals, and my breath caught because the forest was alive with more than just the shadow I had glimpsed, that there were others, younger, smaller, and yet full of life and alertness, and I realized that they must be his, the pups I had heard of in whispers, and that the shadow I had seen was not alone, that his presence carried influence over the creatures around him, shaping, guiding, protecting, and I felt a thrill of both fear and wonder because the pull I felt was not limited to the shadow itself, it radiated outward, encompassing everything connected to him, and even as the night pressed in and the fog curled tighter, I sensed that the forest was watching my reaction, recording it, testing me in ways I could not yet understand, and my curiosity deepened despite the chill that ran through me, because I wanted to see him again, to understand what he was, to understand why he had chosen to reveal himself in fleeting glimpses rather than full presence, and I sensed a deliberate patience in his behavior, an unspoken command that even without words, directed me to watch, to wait, to notice, to feel, and the realization made my chest tighten with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and inexplicable longing, and as I retraced my steps to the cabin, heart hammering, mind racing, I understood that my life had shifted irreversibly, that the forest and the shadow had marked me, claimed my attention, and that no matter how I tried to focus on ordinary tasks, the pull would remain, drawing my thoughts back to the gold eyes, the flicker of black fur among the trees, the soft movement of the pups, and the awareness that the world I had known was giving way to one that operated under rules I could not yet name, and I knew that sleep would not bring relief, that every shadow in the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside my window, every whisper of wind through the trees would remind me that the presence lingered. Invisible but undeniable, magnetic and unnerving. And as I lay awake listening to the forest breathe around me, I understood with both thrill and dread that this first glimpse was only the beginning, that I had stepped into a world that demanded attention, courage, and surrender in ways I could not yet comprehend, and that the curiosity now lodged in my chest would only deepen, drawing me inevitably back into the shadows until I uncovered what waited for me beyond the edges of the ordinary world. The night he finally stepped from the shadows, the world seemed to hold its breath, the mist curling like silver smoke around the trunks of the trees, the moon hanging full and watchful in the sky, and I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end as a presence larger than any I had known drew near, each step deliberate and silent, carrying a power that seemed to bend the air itself. And when he finally emerged into the clearing, I could not look away because the black fur that glimmered under the moonlight was like a living cloak of night, the muscles beneath taut and coiled as if every movement was calculated, and his eyes, golden and luminous, fixed on me with an intensity that both unnerved and fascinated me. A gaze that seemed to pierce beyond the surface, beyond thought and pretense, straight into the marrow of my being, and I felt a pull, magnetic and insistent, tugging at my chest, a force that made every rational instinct fight against fascination, yet failed, because from the moment he stepped fully into view, I sensed a danger in him as palpable as the cold mist pressing against my skin, a danger that should have made me flee, that should have made my heartbeat stutter with fear. Yet there was something else, a heat beneath the danger, a draw that rooted me to the earth and held me in place, unable to move, unable to look away, and I could feel the rhythm of his presence, steady and powerful, like the pulse of the forest itself, a beat that seemed to synchronize with my own, making my chest ache with a longing I did not understand, a need I could not name. And when he tilted his head slightly, just enough for the golden light to catch the edges of his features, I felt a shiver of awareness sweep through me, because it was a moment charged with more than curiosity, more than fascination, more than fear. It was a spark, a current running through the air between us, subtle yet undeniable, and I knew with a certainty that made my stomach twist that this was a moment I would never forget, that the memory would etch itself into me in ways deeper than words. And then I noticed the pups, emerging from the shadows around him, their small forms moving with cautious curiosity, circling my feet, sniffing and observing, their eyes bright and watchful, and I felt an unexpected warmth for them, a tenderness I had not anticipated, because they were part of him, part of this presence that both terrified and enthralled me. And as one of the pups nudged my hand with its wet nose, I glanced up, and the alpha's eyes tracked every movement, a silent command in his gaze, a test, and I realized that he was measuring me, evaluating me, not just as an intruder or a visitor, but as someone who might belong, someone who might matter. And the thought both exhilarated and terrified me, because it carried implications I was not yet ready to confront, yet could not ignore. And then he moved closer, each step measured, deliberate, the power in his body radiating outward, the temperature in the clearing shifting subtly, the air heavy and vibrant with tension, and I could feel the pull of him stronger than ever, a gravity that made it impossible to think clearly, impossible to retreat, impossible to deny. The way my pulse quickened, the way my breath caught in my throat, the way my senses sharpened to a degree I had never known. And when he finally stopped just a few feet from me, close enough that I could see the fine lines of his fur, the way it shimmered in the moonlight, the sharpness of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze, I felt my knees weaken, my chest tighten, and a shiver run down my spine, because every instinct screamed that he was dangerous, that I should step back, that I should flee, yet my body refused to obey, held in place by an invisible tether stronger than fear, stronger than reason, stronger than anything I had ever felt before. And he tilted his head again, a small movement that conveyed both curiosity and amusement, and I noticed the faintest quiver of motion in his pupils, subtle but unmistakable, like a predator intrigued by something both novel and essential. And I realized, with a mixture of dread and thrill, that he had already claimed my attention, that my thoughts and senses were no longer entirely my own, that the pull between us was not a suggestion but a force, a current running through the air that could not be ignored. And then, almost imperceptibly, he lowered his head slightly, just enough to let the light catch his features, and I felt a spark of recognition, primal and visceral, that made the hairs on my arms stand on end, because it was intimate without touch, magnetic without motion, silent communication that bypassed logic entirely, and I understood in that instant that I was dangerously, irrevocably drawn to him, that my fascination was not simply curiosity, but something far deeper, something instinctive, elemental, and binding in a way that frightened me as much as it thrilled. And yet, even in that instant, I sensed a restraint in him, a careful control that suggested awareness of boundaries, of rules I did not yet know, of a world layered with hierarchy and law and consequence, and the tension made every breath heavy, every heartbeat thunder in my chest, every nerve alive with anticipation, because the danger and the allure were inseparable, fused into a single force that left me shaken and alert and yearning all at once, and I found myself studying the way he moved, the subtle shift of weight, the way his eyes never left mine, the way the pups mirrored his motions with trust and awareness, and I realized that to approach him, to understand him, would mean stepping into a world I could not yet see fully, a world that would demand courage, intuition, and surrender, and the recognition both thrilled and terrified me, because it suggested possibilities I could not yet imagine, possibilities that might change my life forever. And when he finally inclined his head slightly toward the pups, allowing me to reach out, to touch them, to connect with a part of him, I felt an electric pulse run through me, a silent acknowledgement that boundaries had shifted, that my presence mattered in ways I had not yet comprehended, and the combination of danger, control, restraint, and magnetic attraction made my chest ache, my hands tremble, my mind whirl, because I understood that what I felt was no ordinary fascination, no fleeting curiosity, no passing intrigue, but something far more consuming, a force that could not be ignored. And as I stepped back to process the intensity of the encounter, the alpha's gaze never leaving mine, the pups watching, the forest holding its breath, I realized with a mixture of awe and dread that I was deeply, irrevocably drawn to him, that every fiber of my being was attuned to his presence, and that the pull I felt would not fade, that the danger and the allure would continue to draw me in, leaving me shaken, breathless, and profoundly aware that the world I had known had shifted irreversibly, and that I had crossed an invisible threshold into a story far larger, far more intense, and far more compelling than anything I could have imagined. After the encounter with him, the world I had thought I understood began to unravel in ways I could no longer ignore, because every ordinary action seemed to collide with something extraordinary, small accidents and strange occurrences layering on top of each other until the mundane and the supernatural were inseparable. And it began with the dreams, vivid and relentless, where I walked through forests bathed in silver light, the shadows moving around me with awareness, whispers brushing my ears, voices I could not place warning, teasing, coaxing me deeper into the unknown, and I would wake with my heart racing, sheets tangled around my legs, the faintest traces of dew or mist on my skin, as if the dreams were not just in my mind but bleeding into reality. And then there were the coincidences, impossible alignments that defied reason. A bird that had died in the path I walked appearing the next morning perfectly poised on a branch above me, a fox that followed me for hours only to vanish without trace, the wind shifting in patterns that felt like messages, a rustle of leaves that repeated the rhythm of my own heartbeat until it became impossible to tell where I ended and the forest began, and the sense of being observed never left me, pressing into my thoughts with a weight that made every glance over my shoulder a necessity. And even in the village, the mundane cracked under the pressure of the unseen, because the people whose eyes I had once trusted now seemed like shadows themselves, whispers following me down aisles and through streets, hints dropped in passing conversations, phrases like, "She does not belong to this world yet," or, "The pack watches," murmured low enough that I was unsure if I had heard correctly or imagined it, and I began to notice patterns, subtle ones, in the behavior of animals and people alike, as though all of Hollow Creek had been quietly reshaped to accommodate a force I could not yet see, and I began to feel it in my body, a subtle vibration in my chest whenever I was near the woods, a magnetic pull that made it impossible to ignore the invisible thread tying me to the forest, to him, to the golden eyes that haunted the corners of my thoughts, and the pull became stronger when the moon rose high, silvering the world in light that seemed to crack the ordinary into fragments. Fragments where shadows moved with intent and the air itself carried messages I could feel rather than hear. And one afternoon, carrying firewood back to the cabin, a sudden gust of wind tore the bundle from my hands, sending logs clattering down the slope, but when I looked, there was no logical explanation, only the sensation of a presence just beyond perception, guiding, testing, reminding me that nothing here was random, that every movement, every accident, was part of a larger pattern I could not yet read. And then came the first direct warning, subtle and terrifying, because I awoke one night to a low growl resonating beneath the floorboards of my cabin, vibrating through my feet and up my spine. A sound so deep and controlled it could not be mistaken for a wild animal, and I could not move, frozen as I listened to the threat, realizing with a cold certainty that the alpha and his pack were not only aware of me but capable of interacting with my world in ways I had never considered, and I understood that the supernatural I had glimpsed was not something distant or hypothetical, but a living force pressing against the boundaries of my existence, reshaping it without permission, and the line between danger and allure blurred because the pull of him, the memory of his golden gaze, made my chest ache and my mind spin while every instinct screamed caution. And then there were the dreams that merged with reality, where I would see his form standing at the edge of the woods in the moonlight and awaken to find paw prints pressed into the soft soil near my cabin, dew glistening along each impression as if he had been there, watching, waiting for me to notice, testing me, and every time I tried to dismiss it, the sense of being followed intensified, the forest whispering secrets in a language I could not yet understand. And on a day when I thought I could return to normalcy, I walked into the clearing to find a circle of disturbed earth, small paw prints and claw marks etched around the perimeter, the moss trampled as though something had danced in deliberate patterns, and I felt the hair on my arms stand on end, my heart pounding with recognition that this was no accident, that the markings were meant for me, and the energy in the clearing was electric, charged with anticipation, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to act, to move, to understand. And I realized in that moment that I had been invited into a world that had rules I did not yet know, rules enforced by forces I could neither see nor reason with, yet that I could feel in the marrow of my bones, and every time I thought I could retreat into ordinary life I found signs that I could not ignore, symbols etched into the bark of trees, stones placed in patterns, the sound of movement in the underbrush that stopped when I approached, only to resume when I turned away, all of it a language of warning and promise, danger and desire. And then, as I tried to process the impossibility of it all, the wind shifted sharply, carrying a scent that made my stomach twist with both recognition and dread, the metallic tang of something living and powerful. And I heard the low growl again, closer this time, vibrating through the air, vibrating through me, and I realized that the pull I had felt from the alpha was no longer distant, no longer a memory, but present, immediate, and every instinct I had honed in these weeks screamed at me to run. Yet my legs would not obey. Rooted as I was by fascination, by fear, by an unnameable need, and the rustle of leaves escalated, snapping of twigs, a low thrum that seemed to echo in my chest, and I knew that danger was arriving in a form I could not yet see, that the forest, the shadow, and the golden eyes I could no longer forget were converging on me, testing me, pushing me, and as the mist thickened, curling around my cabin like spectral fingers reaching for me, I sensed the inevitability of the collision, the supernatural pressing in on my ordinary life until the boundary dissolved entirely, and in that suspended electric moment, I realized that my days of believing in safety and normalcy were over, that the forces I had glimpsed, the golden eyes, the shadow, the forest itself, were claiming me in ways that demanded vigilance, courage, and surrender, and before I could retreat to the cabin, a snap of a branch and a blur in the fog told me that whatever was coming had already arrived. And my breath caught as a cold surge of recognition ran through me, because danger was no longer abstract, it was here, immediate and alive, and I was utterly unprepared for what waited in the darkness just beyond my reach. The bond that began with stolen glances and fleeting glimpses grew in ways I had not anticipated, because every encounter with him left a residue of tension and fascination that clung to me long after he had vanished into the shadows, and the forest seemed to conspire to keep our paths crossing. The wind nudging me toward the clearings, the mist curling in deliberate patterns that guided me closer, and it began subtly, with moments too brief to analyze, a brush of his hand against mine as I reached for a pup, a shared glance that lingered far longer than polite distance allowed, the faintest touch of breath against my ear as he whispered something I could barely hear yet felt like it reverberated through my very bones, and each interaction left me shaken, my chest tight, my thoughts spinning, because it was clear that what was developing between us was forbidden in ways I could not yet define, yet utterly irresistible, and I began to notice the small ways he paid attention, the tilt of his head when I spoke, the way his eyes followed my movements with interest and care, the subtle gestures that communicated more than words ever could, and I found myself seeking him, deliberately walking the paths he favored, listening for the faint rustle of leaves that signaled his approach, noticing how even the smallest acts, the gentle nudge of a pup, the way a branch shifted under his foot, seemed imbued with purpose, as if the world itself was conspiring to make us aware of one another. And with every conversation, whether spoken aloud or shared in silence, the bond deepened because there was a recognition between us that transcended the ordinary, a sense of understanding that passed without language, and I felt my heart open in ways I had long resisted, drawn to a presence that promised danger and warmth in equal measure, thrilling and terrifying. And yet, even as the connection grew, there was a tension underlying it, a reminder of boundaries and the world beyond the clearing, the laws of the pack, the role of the Luna, and the invisible rules that dictated what should and should not happen between us. And I found myself torn, craving proximity, craving understanding, craving him, while simultaneously knowing that every step closer carried consequences I could not yet measure. And we began to share small secrets, fragments of our pasts, details of our lives that seemed trivial yet intimate, and I noticed how he listened, truly listened, the tilt of his head, the slight narrowing of golden eyes that reflected concern, curiosity, and something deeper. And when I shared memories of my childhood, the cabin, the forest, he responded not with judgment but with a quiet presence that made me feel seen in ways no one else ever had. And the pups often nestled between us during these exchanges, warm, soft, living proof of the connection he had to this world, to life, to responsibility, and their trust in me created a bridge I could not deny, a bond that linked me to him even as the danger of the forbidden drew nearer. And I began to notice the subtle ways he protected me, positioning himself where shadows would hide him yet still allow him to observe, shifting his body with an effortless grace that communicated vigilance without words. And I felt an ache in my chest for the closeness and the impossibility of it, for the magnetic pull that refused to be resisted, for the knowledge that to step fully into this connection might alter the course of my life irreversibly. And then came the night when I saw it, the glimpse that shattered every assumption I had made about who or what he was, because we had been walking along the edge of the clearing, the pups frolicking ahead, and I had dared to reach for his hand, letting my fingers brush the coarse fur of his wrist, and he had responded with a soft pressure that anchored me, that reassured me in the way only he could. And in that instant, a shadow passed over his form, and the moonlight struck him in a way that revealed the sharp angles of a face that was not entirely human, the subtle flare of fangs, the faint glow of eyes that burned brighter, more intense than gold, and a ripple of power emanated from him, primal and undeniable, that made the ground beneath my feet feel alive, vibrating in resonance with his presence. And I stumbled back slightly, heart-hammering, breath caught in my throat, and he did not hide it, did not retreat, but let me see, let me witness the raw truth of what he was, dangerous, magnificent, and utterly compelling. And the magnetic pull I had felt only intensified, the attraction deepening despite the danger, despite the impossibility, because the glimpse revealed not only his power but his trust, his willingness to let me see him as he truly was, and the vulnerability in that revelation made my chest ache, my mind reel, my instincts scream caution even as every fiber of my being whispered surrender. And in the flicker of his golden, almost molten eyes, I saw a depth of emotion, of awareness, of connection, that transcended fear, that demanded recognition, that called to something within me I had never known. And I realized that the bond we shared was no longer casual, no longer subtle, it was electric, alive, entwined with instinct and desire and something older and more primal than either of us fully understood. And yet, even in the intimacy of that revelation, there remained a boundary I could not cross, an invisible line dictated by the pack, by the Luna, by the world we inhabited, and the tension of that line made the magnetic pull unbearable, made my chest tight, made every glance, every gesture, every unspoken communication between us crackle with uncontainable energy. And I knew with a clarity that left me breathless that I could not resist him, that the bond had already claimed me in ways I could not undo, that my life was entwined with his, that every heartbeat and every instinct was now tuned to him, to the pups, to the forest, and to the danger and the beauty he embodied. And as I stood there, trembling, heart thundering, watching the subtle flare of his fangs, the powerful shift of his form, the undeniable presence of a being that straddled worlds, I realized that I had crossed an invisible threshold, that the bond had deepened beyond words, beyond reason, into something elemental and inevitable, and I could not, would not, attempt to retreat, because the pull, the connection, the forbidden, intoxicating attraction had already ensnared me, leaving me shaken, breathless, and aware that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. And as the pups tumbled around our feet and the forest whispered its secrets, I understood in my very bones that this night, this glance, this fleeting revelation of his true self, had changed everything, that the world I thought I knew had expanded into one of danger, desire, and undeniable connection, and that I was caught, irrevocably, in the orbit of something far larger, far older, and far more powerful than myself. The days following the glimpse of his true self were a haze of awe, fear, and an unrelenting pull that seemed to tighten around my chest, because even in the ordinary moments, fragments of the extraordinary appeared, subtle and unsettling, a shimmer in the air when he moved too fast to track, a scent that seemed to cling to me after he passed, earthy and wild, the faintest vibration underfoot that hinted at a presence just beyond comprehension, and I could not shake the feeling that the world had expanded to accommodate him, that the ordinary had been stretched thin until the supernatural pressed through the seams, and yet, even as fascination thrummed through me, I felt the first flickers of doubt, the first tremors of fear, because glimpses of his nature suggested power I could not fully grasp, strength and intelligence that went far beyond human limits, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified me, making me wary even as it drew me closer. And one evening, as the forest fell into the quiet hum of twilight, I caught sight of him standing at the edge of the clearing, the mist curling around his legs like living smoke, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, watching me with a patience and intensity that unsettled every instinct. And I realized that the golden glow of his gaze was not constant, that sometimes it flickered like firelight, shadows sliding across the iris in patterns that made my stomach twist and my pulse spike. And I felt the undeniable truth that this being, magnificent and magnetic, carried within him forces I could not hope to predict or control, and even the way he moved suggested a command over the forest itself, the leaves parting as though by intent, the air shifting subtly around him, a quiet gravity that drew the smallest creatures near without a sound, and I understood that he was both protector and predator, a combination that made the fascination inescapable and the danger imminent, and I felt myself trembling at the edge of his presence, unsure if it was caution or longing that held me rooted, because both emotions were inseparable, woven together in ways I could not untangle, and when he spoke, his voice low and measured, it carried an authority that seemed to resonate in the earth itself, each word chosen, deliberate, yet careful, hinting at knowledge and experience that far exceeded my comprehension, and I found myself drawn to listen, drawn to hang on every inflection, because there was comfort in the sound even as it reminded me of the chasm between his world and mine, the vast gulf of power and danger that set us apart even as the magnetic pull insisted on proximity. And then came the incident that left a mark I could not ignore, a sudden unnatural shift in the forest as a shadow passed behind him, a ripple of air that made the trees sway in unison, a movement so fast and fluid that I blinked and questioned what I had seen, but the shiver crawling up my spine told me it had been real, that the fragments of his nature were not illusions but truth partially revealed, and I felt a knot of fear and exhilaration tighten in my chest, because the glimpse of what he could do suggested a power that could protect or destroy, heal or harm, love or consume, and I had no frame of reference, no map for navigating the intensity of his presence, the depth of his being, and yet I was drawn irresistibly to him, craving understanding, craving connection, craving the magnetic energy that hummed in the space between us, and the forest itself seemed to acknowledge it, the wind whispering through the trees as though carrying secrets meant only for me, the mist curling closer as if to guard or conceal, and I realized that my every step, every thought, every heartbeat was attuned to him, to the pull he exerted without touching, without speaking, without revealing. All and the puppies that had once circled me freely now hesitated in his presence, responding to signals I could not perceive, and I understood that his influence extended even over them, that his world and mine were overlapping in ways subtle but undeniable, a collision of ordinary and extraordinary that made my mind reel and my instincts blur, and I began to notice the contradictions that haunted him. The way the warmth in his gaze could shift instantly to an unreadable intensity, the way his protective posture could snap into alertness with no apparent threat, the way he sometimes vanished from sight for a moment only to reappear as though he had been everywhere and nowhere at once, and the realization made me question the safety of proximity, the wisdom of curiosity, the cost of fascination, because the fragments I glimpsed suggested a complexity I was ill-equipped to handle, a depth of experience, history, and power that demanded respect and caution, and yet the pull refused. to a bait, making every warning feel like a challenge, every flicker of mistrust a temptation, every glance a tether I could not sever. And when we spoke, the conversation felt like a dance of hidden truths, his words carefully measured, layered with meaning I could sense but not fully decode, his eyes betraying fragments of history, hints of battles fought, victories claimed, losses endured, and I felt a weight settle in my chest, a mixture of awe, desire, and apprehension, because the more I learned, the more I realized I was only seeing fragments, only glimpses, never the whole, and the gaps between what he revealed and what remained hidden gnawed at me, making me question how much of him I could trust, how much of myself I could risk, and the tension became unbearable when a movement in the forest drew both our attention, a rustle so deliberate it could only have been guided, a presence that reminded me that the unseen world we navigated was vast and indifferent, and I felt the hair on my arms rise, a knot of fear, anticipation, and longing, because the shadows seemed to answer him, to respond to some unspoken command, and in that instant, I realized that my fascination with him was inseparable from the danger he represented, that every heartbeat in my chest echoed with the magnetic pull and the caution it demanded, and I understood that even as I was drawn to him, even as every instinct whispered surrender, a thread of mistrust had lodged in my mind, a shadow that would not fade, a reminder that the fragments of his nature hinted at something I could not fully predict or control, that the allure of connection was inseparable from the risk of betrayal. And as I stepped back into the moonlit clearing, heart pounding, breath uneven, eyes searching the shifting mist for further signs, I felt the weight of the unknown pressing in, a tension that left me exhilarated, frightened, and profoundly aware that the bond one shared with him was far more complex than attraction alone, tangled with danger, power, and secrets. And I knew, with a mixture of dread and longing, that the path ahead would demand vigilance, courage, and careful trust, because fascination and fear now walked hand in hand, shaping every heartbeat, every glance, every whispered thought, leaving me suspended in the delicate, dangerous balance between magnetic pull and shadowed mistrust, even as I tried to steady myself, to convince my mind that the pull toward him was a dangerous illusion. My body betrayed me, responding to his presence before reason could catch up, because every thought of him sent a shiver through my spine, every memory of his golden gaze and the subtle brush of his hand igniting a heat that I could not suppress, and the dreams only made the conflict worse, vivid visions where we stood close in the moonlit forest, the air charged with unspoken intensity. His eyes locked on mine with a gravity that made my chest ache, the sensation of his warmth, the press of his presence, the magnetic current between us weaving around my senses until I could no longer distinguish between dreaming and waking, until every shadow in the forest and every whisper in the wind seemed to carry his intent and his attention, and I found myself walking the same paths he frequented, hoping for a glimpse, a sign, a brush of movement, even though every instinct warned me that proximity was dangerous, that the attraction threading through me was forbidden, potent, and consuming, and yet I could not resist, because the pull was relentless, tugging at the core of me in ways I had never experienced, making me aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every subtle flicker of sensation, and the pups, once my innocent companions, now moved around him with an ease and trust that reminded me how intertwined our worlds had become, how much he had claimed, consciously or not, of my attention, and I felt both awe and fear at the depth of it, because the bond we were forging was beyond reason, beyond safety, and yet undeniably real, and in my waking hours ordinary life felt fragile, as if the boundaries between the mundane and the supernatural had thinned, so that every rustle in the trees, every flicker of shadow, every unexpected scent carried the possibility of him, and I found myself imagining his presence even when he was absent, feeling the warmth of his body in the corner of my mind, hearing the low timbre of his voice as if the wind itself had learned to speak his language, and the tension built with every encounter, every fleeting glimpse, every stolen look, because the forbidden nature of what I felt intensified the pull, sharpening both desire and apprehension, and I became aware that resistance was futile, that my body, my mind, my very instincts were attuned to him, and yet the danger of surrender lingered, an unspoken threat that coiled around me as tightly as the magnetic current that drew me forward. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and the forest was bathed in gold and shadow, I found him waiting at the edge of the clearing, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, the golden glow of his eyes softened by the dying light, and my pulse surged at the sight, because every instinct in me recognized the inevitability of the moment, the gravitational pull that had been building from the first glimpse until now, and I tried to steel myself to remind myself of boundaries of the pack, of the Luna, of the world we both inhabited, but the effort was wasted, because the magnetic tension between us was palpable, vibrating through the air and the soil and the leaves, a force I could not resist, and as I stepped forward, drawn as if by invisible chains, I felt a ripple in the forest, subtle yet undeniable, a recognition of the connection that had been quietly forming, a response that made every nerve alive, every sense sharpened, and I realized that the line between danger and desire had dissolved, leaving only the raw intensity of attraction, forbidden and impossible, and the pups bounded around us, a living testament to the bond that already existed, but even they seemed to sense the heightened tension, pausing and looking up at us as if acknowledging the storm of emotion that hung in the air. And when he finally spoke, his voice low and measured, it carried a weight that made the ground beneath my feet feel alive, each word resonating through me, vibrating in tandem with my heartbeat, and I knew that resistance was impossible, that the pull was no longer a subtle force but a current that would sweep me along whether I willed it or not. And yet fear lingered, a shadow at the edge of my mind, reminding me of the power he possessed, of the mysteries I had yet to understand, of the consequences of surrendering entirely, and the juxtaposition of desire and danger made every breath electric, every glance a silent challenge, and I became acutely aware of the way he studied me, not with judgment but with an intensity that felt like recognition, like an acknowledgement of the bond that had taken root, and I realized that he understood the effect he had on me, that every move, every shift of weight, every glance was deliberate, testing me, measuring me, drawing me in while reminding me of the precariousness of the connection, and my chest ached with the tension, the longing, the impossible allure, because even as I fought to maintain control, even as my mind whispered caution, my body responded in ways I could not command, every nerve alive to him, every instinct awake, and when his hand brushed against mine, accidental or intentional, I could feel a pulse of energy, a spark that made my knees weaken and my chest tighten, a current that ran through me, connecting us in ways that defied logic, and I realized then that the line I had tried to hold, the restraint I had tried to maintain, had already been crossed, invisibly yet undeniably, and my heartbeat thundered with anticipation, fear, and desire, the forest around us responding with whispers and rustles, a living witness to the growing intensity, and I understood in a visceral way that surrender was imminent, that temptation would no longer wait for permission, that the magnetic pull threading between us was more than attraction, more than curiosity. It was a force that demanded acknowledgement, that would not be denied, that would drag me into its orbit whether I consented or not. And as I stared into the molten gold of his eyes, feeling the strength and the danger in every line of his form, I realized with a mixture of dread and exhilaration that I was standing on the precipice of something irreversible, that my desires had tangled with the supernatural, that my emotions could no longer be disentangled from the magnetic force drawing me toward him. And when he took a step closer, the tension in the clearing intensified, the air thickened with anticipation, and I felt it in my bones, in my pulse, in every breath, that the temptation I had been resisting for weeks, the pull I had tried to deny, had arrived in full force, undeniable, irresistible, and impossible to ignore. And I knew that the moment to resist had passed, that the currents of desire, fascination, and danger had converged, leaving me poised on the edge of surrender, caught between fear and fascination, and as he reached out toward me, the golden glow of his eyes capturing the last light of the setting sun, I realized that I could no longer pretend resistance was an option, that the collision of longing and magnetic attraction had become a storm I could not step away from, and that the next heartbeat, the next touch, the next choice would change everything. The air had shifted in ways I could feel in my bones long before I saw the signs, a tension that threaded through the forest and even into the village, subtle at first, whispers of movement too deliberate to be ordinary, shadows that lingered in the corner of my vision, and I knew that the equilibrium I had trusted was fracturing, because forces beyond my understanding were stirring, coalescing, and pressing against the boundaries of my fragile world, and the figure I had been drawn to with fascination and fear carried with him echoes of a past that was neither simple nor safe, a history that now bled into the present in ways that left me unsettled, because the golden glow of his eyes, once magnetic and mesmerizing, now held hints of unease, the faintest flicker of tension that suggested he too sensed the looming threat, and it began with small signs, inexplicable disturbances in the clearing where the pups played, tufts of fur disturbed in ways that suggested an Unseen presence, low growls that did not belong to the pack, a rustle of underbrush that stopped when I approached yet left an energy behind that pricked my skin and set my nerves on edge, and the villagers, once oblivious to the forest's mysteries, began to murmur with unease, their eyes darting to shadows, their voices dropping when I passed, as if they sensed the currents of danger that had begun to seep into our lives, and I felt the first real sting of fear because the figures past, the power he carried, the enemies he had faced, were now not confined to history. They were encroaching, bleeding into our present with a subtle, insidious energy that left me unmoored, heart pounding with anticipation and dread, because the pull that had drawn me to him so strongly was now intertwined with the threat that loomed at the edges of our world, and I began to notice the patterns, small yet undeniable, shadows gathering just beyond the clearing, movement in the fog that made my pulse spike, and when I glanced at him, I saw the same recognition mirrored in his gaze, the flicker of worry, the tightening of his jaw, the slight curl of a fist that suggested readiness, vigilance, and the knowledge that what approached was not ordinary, not something the forest could contain, not something to be met lightly, and yet there was no time to retreat, no chance to hide from what was coming, because the currents of danger moved faster than any human reckoning, faster than I could imagine, and I felt the gravity of my own position, caught between curiosity, attraction, and the stark reality of threat, knowing that surrendering to the pull I had felt for weeks might now carry consequences far graver than I had ever anticipated. And the pups, once playful and innocent, sensed it too, their fur bristling, low growls vibrating in the air, the tension threading through the clearing as if the forest itself was bracing for a confrontation. And when he stepped forward, his stance shifting subtly, muscles coiled like springs, eyes scanning the shadows, I realized the depth of what he carried, the responsibility he bore, and the cost it demanded, and a shiver ran down my spine as I recognized the gravity of the unseen forces aligning, because the pull I had so desperately tried to ignore, the magnetic attraction that had dominated my thoughts, was now entangled with danger in ways that made every heartbeat loud, every breath shallow, every step deliberate, and the forest seemed alive, the trees whispering secrets in the wind, the mist curling as if to warn me, to protect me, or perhaps to obscure the full measure of what was approaching, and I understood in a visceral way that the supernatural currents surrounding him were not dormant, not idle, but responsive, alive, and capable of acting with intention, and the realization made my stomach twist, because while the figure I was drawn to exuded protection and strength, the fragments of his past suggested enemies with equal power and equal cunning, adversaries I could not see yet could feel pressing through the layers of reality, shadows that moved with predatory intelligence, the faintest traces of malice in the air that set my nerves on edge, and the pull that had once been purely fascination was now threaded with fear, because attraction and danger had become inseparable, and every instinct screamed that the equilibrium of my life, of the forest, of the pack itself, was at stake, and when the first unmistakable sign appeared, a shape moving in the periphery of my vision, too fast, too deliberate to be ordinary, a pulse of energy that made the air thrum and my chest tighten. I froze, heart hammering, every sense alert, and I saw him react instantly, a flash of controlled power, a tilt of the head, the subtle flare of fangs, the low growl vibrating through the clearing, commanding attention, asserting presence, and I realized then that whatever approached was not just an abstract threat, it was immediate, tangible, and directly tied to him, to his past, to the life and danger he had carried silently for years, and the pull that had drawn me into fascination, into temptation, into closeness, now became a tether binding me to the danger, because to be near him was to be caught in the orbit of forces I could neither resist nor fully understand, and my pulse quickened as shadows thickened in the trees, as the wind shifted, carrying scents that twisted and merged with the forest, signaling the arrival of something ancient, something capable of harm, something that had followed him through lifetimes or battles I could not imagine. And I realized with a sinking awareness that this was the moment the past had arrived, that the unseen adversaries, the dark forces, the rivals he had hinted at in fleeting glances and half-truths, were now converging on the clearing, their presence palpable in the tension that hummed through the mist, and I felt a cold thrill of fear that ran alongside the magnetic pull I had always felt for him, because desire and danger were now inseparable threads, each amplifying the other, leaving my body tense, my mind racing, and my heart torn between the instinct to flee and the irresistible need to stay, to witness, to face what was coming with him. And as the figure shifted slightly, muscles coiled, ears angled to the unseen threat, fangs glinting faintly in the silver light, I realized that I was no longer a passive observer, that my life, my heartbeat, my choices, were now enmeshed in the collision of forces gathering in the clearing, and the mist thickened, shadows elongated, the wind stilled as if holding its breath, and I understood with a sharp, visceral certainty that the threat was real, immediate and unstoppable, and that everything I had felt for him, every pulse of fascination, every moment of desire, every inch of trust and connection, would be tested in ways I could not yet anticipate, leaving me trembling, alert, and acutely aware that the world I had been drawn into was far larger, far darker, and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined, and there was no turning back, because the danger had arrived, and I was caught, irrevocably, in its orbit that I had always believed my family to be ordinary, grounded in the small routines of the village, rooted in lives that belonged firmly to the human world. And yet the moment I stumbled upon the tattered journals hidden beneath the floorboards of my childhood home, dusty and brittle with age, I realized that every assumption I had ever held about myself and my bloodline was a lie, because the pages were filled with symbols, markings, and stories that spoke of a lineage, intertwined with forces I had only glimpsed in whispers and shadow, the inked words describing rituals and prophecies that traced my ancestors back to a time when humans and the supernatural coexisted in delicate balance. And one name appeared repeatedly, a name I recognized with a jolt that made my heart seize because it was mine, written in connection with deeds and destinies I had never imagined could touch me, and as I read on, the realization settled like ice in my veins, that the pull I had felt toward the figure in the forest, the magnetic attraction that had consumed my thoughts and body for weeks, was not coincidence, was not mere curiosity, but tied to the very essence of my blood, to a lineage that had been whispered about in fear, secrecy, and reverence, and I saw references to an ancient prophecy, one that spoke of a mate chosen not by chance but by the intertwining of bloodlines, of golden eyes recognizing a counterpart whose presence would awaken dormant powers, prophecy that foretold both union and upheaval, protection and peril, and every word I read made the forest outside my window seem more alive, more knowing, as though it had been waiting for me to uncover this truth, waiting for me to understand why the pull I felt toward him had been irresistible, inevitable, because it had been written into my very veins centuries before I was born, and I saw descriptions of enemies, rivals who would seek to prevent the union, forces determined to ensure the prophecy never came to fruition, and I felt a wave of fear that left my knees weak, because the shadows I had sensed stalking me, the rustles in the trees, the tension that vibrated through the clearing when he was near, were not random but tied to my lineage, to the blood that ran through me, to a destiny I had never asked for yet could not escape, and as I turned the pages, I discovered a series of portraits faded with time, faces that bore uncanny resemblance to my own, ancestors whose eyes glimmered with the same intensity, whose presence had been markers of power, and I realized with a jolt that the family I had thought ordinary had carried within them the seed of the supernatural, dormant and hidden, waiting for the right moment, the right encounter to awaken, and I understood why the figure in the forest had been drawn to me with such force, why the pull I could not resist had existed long before we met, a gravitational inevitability encoded in generations of blood and whispered prophecy, and the revelations deepened when I discovered a second set of documents, letters written in urgent, almost frantic script, recounting confrontations with creatures and forces I had never known, warnings sent through generations, pleading that descendants be cautious, that they recognize the signs, that they prepare, and a name appeared again, my name or a variation of it, written as if it had been foreseen centuries ago, marked as central to events that could either unite or destroy the balance between worlds, and I felt the weight of centuries settle on my shoulders, a history I had never lived but one that demanded reckoning, awareness and courage, because I was not just an observer or a victim of circumstance, I was a participant, a linchpin, a choice point for forces far older and far more potent than anything I had ever imagined, and the pull toward the figure, the magnetic draw, suddenly made terrifying sense, for it was not mere desire, it was destiny, a convergence of bloodlines, prophecy, and supernatural alignment, and my mind reeled at the implications because the dangers he had faced, the rivals who were stirring now, were not abstract, not distant, they were tied to me, to the legacy of my ancestors, to the very life I had thought ordinary, and I felt a rush of panic, nausea, and exhilaration all at once, because the ordinary world I had known dissolved in the shadow of revelation, leaving only the forest, the figure, the prophecy and the fragile, electric tension of what was to come. And I remembered the low growls, the rustling shadows, the flashes of power I had glimpsed in him, and realized that they were warnings, signals of forces that had been waiting for centuries for the convergence that now could not be avoided. And every instinct I had honed in recent weeks told me to run, to flee the forest, to abandon curiosity, to reject the pull, but the very blood in my veins refused, responding instead with recognition, with resonance, with the undeniable awareness that I was inextricably bound to the figure who had haunted my dreams and waking hours, that we were part of the same story, the same prophecy, and that resistance was impossible. And yet fear surged in tandem with fascination, because the pages described consequences, destruction, betrayal, enemies who would stop at nothing, and I realized that my choice, my acceptance or rejection, could tip the scales in ways I could not anticipate, that my very life and the lives of those I had come to care for, including the pups who bounded innocently through the forest, could hang in the balance, and the weight of centuries pressed down on me, the knowledge of ancestors who had failed, who had succeeded, who had tried and been broken, and I felt the lineage of blood, of destiny, of prophecy, intertwining with the present in a way that made my pulse thunder and my thoughts spiral, because I was now at the center of a story written long before my birth, a story that demanded courage, awareness, and the surrender of innocence. And as I clutched the final pages, trembling, eyes wide, heart racing, I understood that my fascination, my pull toward the figure, my magnetic attraction, had never been optional, that it had been encoded into me, predestined, a force as inevitable as the rise and fall of the moon, and a cold, shivering realization hit me, that the world I had known, the life I had lived, the identity I had trusted were all illusions, and that from this moment forward, I would be defined not by ordinary existence, but by the blood that ran through me, the prophecy that had claimed me, and the connection to a figure whose power, danger, and destiny now intertwined with my own in ways that left me shaken to the very core of my being, breathless, awed, and irrevocably changed after discovering the truths hidden in my family's past. I thought I understood why the pull toward him had been so overwhelming, why every glance, every fleeting touch had felt inevitable, but trust proved far more complicated than revelation, because the more I tried to bridge the distance between curiosity, desire, and fear, the more I realized that even he, for all his strength and seeming openness, carried shadows I could not read, secrets he hesitated to share, and moments when his gaze flickered with an unreadable tension that made me question whether the bond we had built was as genuine as it felt or a delicate illusion. And it began with the small things, the tiny inconsistencies that made my pulse spike, the way he would shift when I asked about his past, the carefully measured words that seemed to dance around truths I ached to know, and I found myself scrutinizing every gesture, every phrase, every pause, searching for hidden meaning, trying to separate instinct from reality, because the forest and the clearing had become a crucible where my emotions were amplified, where the magnetic pull between us collided with fear, and the world beyond the trees seemed more fragile, more aware of us, as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for a misstep. And then came the moment when a warning arrived, subtle yet undeniable, a rustle in the underbrush, the movement of a shadow that responded to neither wind nor animal, a low vibration in the soil that reverberated through my legs, and I realized that the dangers tied to his past were not just stories or fragments of history, they were alive, they were watching, and I felt a tightening in my chest, a surge of adrenaline that demanded clarity, demanded caution, demanded trust, and yet, when I turned to him, seeking answers, his golden eyes met mine with warmth yet carried in intensity that suggested he, too, was balancing the pull of openness against the weight of concealment, and I could not tell if the hesitation in his expression was protection, manipulation, or a blend I could not untangle, and the tension became unbearable, because the bond that had drawn me so inexorably to him was now threaded with uncertainty, and every heartbeat reminded me that the pull could not be ignored even as the cracks in trust threatened to shatter everything, and the pups, who had once bounded freely between us, seemed attuned to the subtle undercurrents, their playful energy muted, alert, responsive to the unspoken tension, and I wondered if instinct, more primal than my own reasoning, was warning me of the fissures that even I could feel but could not yet name. And it all came to a head one evening in the clearing when shadows deepened unnaturally, the forest thick with anticipation, and I noticed him flinch at a noise I could not hear, a movement I could not see. And instinctively, I stepped closer, reaching toward him, wanting to anchor us both, wanting the magnetic pull to outweigh the tension, to remind him and me that connection had always been stronger than fear, but he pulled slightly back, his hand hovering tense, and the subtle recoil felt like rejection, like mistrust, and the moment fractured me because the push and pull mirrored the uncertainty gnawing at my mind, the struggle to reconcile fascination with suspicion, desire with fear. Because I knew that there were enemies approaching, forces stirred by the revelation of my lineage, by the prophecy tied to blood long hidden, by the convergence that had been inevitable, and yet his restraint suggested he was keeping something from me, something I had a right to know, and my chest tightened with the conflicting emotions of longing and apprehension, because the bond that had been electric, irresistible, had become a wire stretched taut between faith and doubt, and the forest seemed to mirror it, the trees bending in strange patterns, the mist curling as if to isolate us, to test us. And I realized that the line between trust and deception had blurred, that every word he spoke, every pause, every subtle gesture now carried the weight of uncertainty, of potential betrayal, of secrets held too long, and the magnetic pull that had been my guide for weeks was now tangled with the shadow of suspicion, because instinct warned me that openness could be a trap, that reliance could invite harm, that the force drawing me to him could be both salvation and danger intertwined, and I questioned whether he had ever intended to reveal the full truth, whether the glimpses I had been allowed to see were fragments of honesty or carefully curated to manipulate, and the thought made my stomach twist, my pulse accelerate, because I did not want to believe it yet could not dismiss it, and I saw the way he moved in the clearing, careful, measured, vigilant, a predator and protector in equal measure. And I realized that every instinct I had trusted for weeks was now a double-edged blade, teaching me attraction and wariness simultaneously, sharpening awareness, intensifying tension, and I felt my emotions spiral, desire and fear tangled so tightly that I could not separate them, and every glance, every breath, every heartbeat became a study in restraint and temptation, because even as suspicion festered, I could not resist the pull that had claimed me, that had bound me to him, and the pups, sensing the subtle change in energy, clustered closer, their innocence and trust, highlighting the stark contrast between safety and threat, and I understood that our connection was now tested not by magic or fate alone, but by the fragility of trust, the weight of half-truths, and the shadows of past enemies circling just beyond perception, and I questioned whether revelation would strengthen the bond or shatter it entirely, whether honesty would save us or whether secrets, even small ones, would create a chasm too wide to bridge. And as the forest seemed to hold its breath, the mist curling thicker, the rustle of unseen forces pressing closer, I realized that despite the magnetic pull, despite the depth of connection, despite the bond that had begun with fascination and destiny, suspicion had entered, had taken root, and the delicate balance of trust and desire, attraction and fear, was now poised on a knife's edge, leaving me both drawn to him and wary, longing for truth yet terrified of what it might reveal. And as I stood there, heart pounding, breath shallow, eyes searching the shadows, I felt the cold, creeping realization that even the strongest bond could be tested, and that the next choice, the next word, the next revelation could either cement trust or let suspicion fester. A silent predator waiting to undo everything, leaving me shaken, uncertain, and profoundly aware that the path ahead would demand not only courage and desire but vigilance, perception, and the willingness to navigate a world where even love could be laced with deception. The forest felt different that evening, heavier, denser, as if the air itself carried the weight of unseen eyes tracking every movement, and I sensed it before I saw it, the subtle rustle of underbrush that did not belong to wind or animal, the faint vibration beneath my feet that spoke of a presence moving with intent and precision, and my pulse quickened because I knew instinctively that the enemies, the rivals whose whispers and shadows had haunted me for weeks, were no longer content to remain hidden, that the threads of danger had tightened, pulling the forest, the clearing, and every heartbeat into a web of threat, and I glanced toward him, the figure who had drawn me with magnetic pull, and saw the tension coiled in his stance, muscles flexed, ears angled, eyes scanning, fangs glinting faintly as if catching the dying light, and I realized that even he, powerful and alert, recognized the escalation, and I felt the first real pang of fear for myself and for those I had come to care. For the pups circling cautiously, noses to the ground, ears pricked, alert to shifts I could barely detect, and I understood that the protective veil we had relied upon was fracturing, that boundaries between safety and peril were dissolving, that the forest, once a sanctuary, was now a battlefield whose front lines had extended into the spaces I had considered secure, and it began subtly, shadows moving with unnatural speed, a low growl vibrating through the clearing, distant at first, then closer, echoing in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. And I felt my breath catch, chest tightening. Because the unseen forces were testing, probing, advancing with a deliberate patience that made each step forward dangerous, each glance a measure of risk, and I saw him shift, eyes narrowing, body coiled, and knew that he was ready to act, to defend, to strike if needed, and the magnetic pull that had drawn me to him mingled now with terror, because desire could not shield me from the predators closing in, and the forest responded to the tension, the mist curling unnaturally, the leaves whispering in a cadence that hinted at intelligence, at anticipation, and I felt a shiver of dread as the first figure emerged from the shadows, indistinct yet unmistakable, moving with a grace that made my stomach twist, and then another, until the clearing seemed alive with the approach of unseen enemies, each step deliberate, each presence a threat, and I realized that resistance, flight, or distraction would be insufficient, that the sheer force of numbers and intent meant we were already at the mercy of forces I had barely begun to comprehend, and the pups, sensing danger, pressed close, circling me with low whines, instinctively protective yet powerless against the beings closing in. And I felt the magnetic figure beside me stiffen, the pull between us sharpened into a tether of shared urgency, shared vulnerability, and yet I could sense the uncertainty in him, the knowledge that even his strength might be insufficient to shield all of us if the enemy struck decisively, and I swallowed hard, heart pounding, realizing that the lessons of trust and temptation, of prophecy and bloodline, had led me here, to a moment where instinct, courage and survival intertwined, and I felt the weight of every choice I had made in the past weeks, every decision to remain close, every moment of fascination, every heartbeat spent tethered to him, because it had brought me to this precipice, to the edge of confrontation, to a point where the ordinary world I had known was gone, replaced by a primal tension that electrified every nerve and trembled in the air. And I saw movement in the shadows, a flicker, a blur, and realized that the first of the enemies had closed the distance with supernatural speed. And my stomach dropped because there was no warning, no time to act, only reaction, and the forest seemed to contract around us, the clearing narrowing, every escape route obscured by the mist and by the advancing forms, and I felt the magnetic pull that had defined our connection shift, stretched taut with fear, anticipation and necessity, because I could sense his intent to protect, to defend, to act with lethal precision. Yet I knew the danger was overwhelming, the numbers, the strategy, the experience of the enemies beyond anything I had faced, and the tension pressed into me, squeezing breath from my lungs, tightening my chest, heightening every sense, until the whispers of the forest became deafening, until every rustle of leaf and twist of mist carried meaning, warning and threat, and I realized then that the forest itself had become a cage, the mist a curtain behind which predators waited, and I was caught in the center, exposed, vulnerable, the pups instinctively grouping around me, the magnetic figure at my side, muscles coiled, eyes scanning, fangs glinting, and I understood that survival required more than instinct or courage, required trust, action, and recognition of every subtle sign. Yet even as I acknowledged it, my chest tightened with fear, because the shadows moved with a predatory patience that made the heartbeat between steps unbearable, and then came the moment that made me freeze, the sudden flash of movement to my left, a figure stepping from the darkness with intent and malice etched in posture and gaze, eyes glowing faintly with a recognition of power that matched ours, and I realized with a lurch that the threat was not abstract or approaching, it was here, tangible, deliberate and closing, forcing us toward one side of the clearing, cutting off retreat, herding us into a corner where every instinct screamed danger, where every nerve strained for escape, where every heartbeat rang like a drum of warning, and I felt the tension coil tighter, magnetic attraction and fear entwined, desire and survival clashing, because I could not leave him, could not abandon the pull that had defined me, could not ignore the danger that now pressed against every side, and yet the forest, thick with mist and shadow, offered no route, no refuge, only the electric hum of threat, the circling movement of unseen adversaries, the low growls and rustles of animals responding to forces beyond their comprehension, and I realized with a sinking weight that the next moments would define everything, that the balance between survival, trust, attraction and power had never been more fragile, and as I felt the magnetic tether pulling me toward him even as the corner of the clearing shrank under the advance of enemies, I understood that we were caught, exposed, and poised on the edge of confrontation that would demand every ounce of courage, every shred of awareness, and every beat of instinct, because the shadows had closed in, and there was no turning back, no escape, only the charged tension of survival and the magnetic pull of a bond tested by danger, leaving me breathless, trembling, and suspended in a moment where every choice would matter, and the enemy moved closer still, eyes glinting, muscles coiled, anticipation thrumming in the air, and I knew with absolute clarity that I had been forced into a corner, surrounded, vulnerable, and the next heartbeat could change everything. The air between us was charged, heavy with the electricity of desire and fear, every glance, every brush of movement carrying the weight of weeks of tension, and even as the forest pressed in around us with shadows and whispering wind, I could feel him, the magnetic figure who had haunted my dreams and waking hours, his presence pulling at the core of me, igniting a heat I could neither deny nor escape, and it was in the small moments, the subtle shifts of stance, the deliberate closeness of our bodies, that I realized how irreversible our connection had become, how the attraction threading through us had grown into something far more potent, consuming, and dangerous, because the magnetic pull that had first drawn me to him was no longer abstract, no longer a teasing tension. It was a force that coiled through my veins, that made my pulse race, my breath hitch, that made my hands twitch with the need to reach, to touch, to close the distance that had defined weeks of longing and unspoken desire. And as we stood in the clearing, the pups clustering protectively at our feet, shadows shifting like sentinels in the mist, I felt the weight of our combined tension, the delicate balance between surrender and restraint, and when his hand brushed against mine, accidental or not, a spark leapt through me, igniting every nerve, sending shivers down my spine and making my knees tremble, because the contact carried more than touch, it carried recognition, understanding, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been building in secret and in silence, and I wanted to give in, to let the pull dictate every heartbeat, every breath, but the shadow of danger pressed at the edges of my awareness, reminding me that enemies lurked, that rivals circled unseen, that every step toward surrender could draw us into a trap, and yet the magnetic force between us was undeniable, a current stronger than fear, stronger than caution, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn as if by invisible threads, heart hammering, breath shallow, until our faces were inches apart, eyes locked in a gaze that said everything we had not dared to speak, and I could feel his warmth, smell the faint, intoxicating scent of him carried by the forest, hear the low vibration of his voice even in silence, and it was intoxicating, maddening, overwhelming, because desire and danger had entwined, making the air tremble, making the forest itself seem to pulse with our tension. And when he whispered my name, low, deliberate, threaded with a warning I could not fully interpret, my chest tightened, breath caught, and I realized that this moment, fragile and potent, could tip everything, could change the balance between fear, trust, attraction, and peril, and I wanted to melt into him, to surrender to the magnetic pull that had guided me for weeks, but instinct, sharpened by danger, reminded me that our closeness was a risk, a beacon for enemies who had been circling, waiting, watching, calculating the perfect moment to strike, and still desire overrode caution, because even as I knew the danger, even as I felt the threat brushing the edges of the clearing like a shadow with teeth, I could not step back, could not deny the fire that roared between us, could not resist the pull that had been growing since the first fleeting glance, since the first spark of recognition that he was more than human, more than magnetic, that he was entwined with my destiny in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. And when his hand cupped my cheek, firm yet gentle, I felt the world narrow to the two of us, the forest, the pups, the shadows, all fading into a background hum while the current between us surged, undeniable, and I wanted to close the distance, to let our lips meet, to feel the heat, the connection, the affirmation of everything we had tried to deny, to resist, to control, and in that moment, the magnetic pull felt like gravity, inescapable, inevitable, and I leaned closer, heart hammering, pulse a drumbeat in my ears, every nerve alive with anticipation and fear, and he met me halfway, our breaths mingling, the warmth of him so close it stole my breath, the scent, the presence, the danger and desire, all colliding in a perfect storm that made my knees weak and my heart race like a wild drum, and I felt the first brush of lips, tentative, questioning, and it was electric, consuming, a confirmation of everything we had felt yet feared to acknowledge. And I wanted to linger in that impossible, suspended moment, to let time itself pause, but instinct slammed into my spine, alerting me, warning me, reminding me that surrender came at a cost, because just as our lips met, just as the magnetic pull became unbearable, the forest erupted with sound, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the clearing, and I jerked back, heart in my throat, eyes wide, as movement flashed from the shadows, too fast to track, a predator emerging with intent, and in an instant the magical tension, the attraction, the forbidden closeness was interrupted, replaced by raw survival instinct, because the enemy, whoever or whatever it was, had found us, had recognized our vulnerability, and the pup scattered with sharp cries, ears flattened, and I felt him stiffen beside me, every muscle coiled, golden eyes blazing, fangs glinting faintly in the dim light, and my chest heaved with the collision of desire and terror, every nerve alive, every heartbeat racing, because in that moment, the magnetic pull that had been our bond became a lifeline, a tether anchoring me to him as danger slammed into our world, and I realized with a jolt that our first surrender, our first acknowledgement of forbidden passion, had been observed, exploited, and the predator in the shadows had waited for this exact moment, and I was forced to choose between the warmth, the fire, the undeniable connection I craved and the raw necessity to survive, and the pull that had been irresistible now became a tether in the storm, pulling me toward him even as every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to protect the pups, and I felt the first brush of fear mingled with longing in a way that left my chest tight, breath shallow, and my mind racing, because desire and danger had collided in a heart-stopping instant, leaving us poised on the knife edge of temptation and survival, and the forest held its breath as the enemy emerged fully from the shadows, a figure more dangerous than I had imagined, and I realized that the magnetic, forbidden, intoxicating pull that had drawn us together was about to be tested in ways neither of us could ignore, and before I could even draw a breath, a sudden violent movement from the corner of the clearing sent a cascade of leaves and shadow rushing toward us, and I froze, golden eyes locked on mine, muscles tensed, and I knew with absolute certainty that our stolen moment of forbidden passion had been interrupted, that the predator had arrived, and that the next heartbeat would determine everything. The predator's sudden emergence shattered the fragile tension that had hung between us, ripping the forest into a cacophony of sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and low guttural growls that made my chest tighten and my pulse hammer as the pups scattered in every direction, and in that moment, the magnetic pull that had bound me to him, the forbidden passion we had finally allowed ourselves to acknowledge, was swallowed by pure instinct, raw survival, and the undeniable threat pressing from every side. And I watched in horror as the figure I had trusted and desired moved with predatory precision, a blur of gold and shadow, muscles coiling and uncoiling as he engaged the enemy, eyes blazing, fangs glinting. Yet even as he fought, I could feel the strain, the weight of responsibility that he bore not just for himself but for me, for the pups, for the fragile connection that had defined our weeks together, and it became painfully clear that desire, attraction, and trust were luxuries we could not afford in the heat of imminent danger, because every movement, every action had consequences, and one misstep could mean death or betrayal, and I found myself frozen for a heartbeat, torn between rushing into him, allowing instinct and longing to guide me, and heeding the primal warnings that screamed from the forest floor, the rustling shadows, the hairs rising along my arms, every nerve alight with tension, and as I hesitated, the enemy struck with calculated precision, claws raking through air, teeth flashing in the dim light, and I felt a ripple of fear wash over me so strong that it momentarily overpowered the magnetic pull that had drawn me to him for weeks. And then came the sound, a sharp, piercing cry that made my stomach twist, a cry that was not his, not mine, but carried the unmistakable tone of the pups, scattering their fear into the night, and I surged forward instinctively, heart pounding, legs moving faster than thought, and saw the golden figure lunge to protect one of the smaller threats, only to be momentarily overwhelmed, and in that instant I realized the terrifying truth that even his power, his skill, his supernatural presence had limits, and that the enemy was more cunning, more prepared, more merciless than I had imagined, and every instinct screamed for action, for survival, for defense, but also for restraint, because one wrong move could mean catastrophe, and I felt my hands shake, breath catching, as I tried to reconcile the magnetic desire that still pulled me to him with the raw, chaotic fear that now defined the clearing, and I watched, horrified, as an enemy's shadow moved too close, claws slicing through the air, eyes glinting with recognition and malice, and he roared, a sound that vibrated through the trees, through the mist, through my very core, and I felt my heart ache because the roar carried both protection and warning, a reminder that he could not shield me from everything, that even his strength was not infinite, and as I closed the distance propelled by desperation and longing, The enemy lunged at us simultaneously, claws and teeth flashing in synchronized chaos. And the figure twisted, a blur of motion, but the impact sent him tumbling back, rolling through leaves and roots, and I froze, every muscle taut, because for a fleeting second, he was vulnerable, human in his vulnerability despite the supernatural aura he exuded, and my mind screamed at me to act, to intervene, to reach him, but instinct restrained me, because one wrong move could compromise everything, and the magnetic pull that had defined our bond now felt like a tether holding me at a distance, painful and impossible, because I could not close it fast enough to help without risking annihilation, and in that heartbeat, the predator struck him with unexpected force, throwing him against a tree, and my chest constricted, breath catching, eyes wide, tears threatening as I realized that the bond, the connection, the forbidden passion we had barely begun to explore, could be severed in an instant, and I felt anger, fear, helplessness, and desire collide in a tumultuous wave. Because I had no choice but to watch, to endure the separation forced by circumstance, by danger, by the undeniable power of the enemy arrayed against us, and the pups whimpered from the edges of the clearing, scattering further into the mist, amplifying the helplessness that coiled through me, because our small pack, our fragile unit, was under assault, and I could do nothing but feel helpless, exposed, and desperate, and as he struggled to rise, golden eyes blazing with defiance and a silent plea that I resist temptation, resist interference, I realized with crushing clarity that even he could not protect all of us, that the magnetic force that had drawn me to him, the pull that had made desire unbearable and irresistible, now served only to heighten the agony of separation, because we were caught on opposite ends of chaos, fighting different battles, yet tethered invisibly by the bond we could not sever, and my body ached to move toward him, to close the gap, to affirm that connection, but the forest, the shadows, the enemy, and my own survival instincts forced me to remain still, breathing shallow, heart hammering, as I watched him rise, fight, and yet falter under the relentless assault, and every movement, every roar, every strike carved itself into my memory, a brutal choreography of power, danger, and desperation that underscored the reality that trust, attraction, and love were luxuries in a world poised on the edge of annihilation. And then came the final blow for that moment, a strike that forced him back into the depths of the mist, away from me, and I felt the magnetic tether stretch to its breaking point, a painful, aching pull that left me hollow, exposed, and trembling, because he was gone from my sight, even for seconds, and I was left in the clearing, surrounded by shadows and whispering trees, the pups whimpering nearby, and a cold, cruel realization hit me, that the bond we had built, the forbidden attraction that had consumed me, could not prevent separation when the world pressed against us with teeth and claws and intent, and I sank to my knees, heart racing, tears pricking, breath uneven, because I understood that the battle was not over, that the danger was far from past, and that the figure I had risked so much to trust, to desire, to surrender to, was now out of reach, leaving me reeling with loss, uncertainty, and the profound ache of being tethered to someone I could not protect. And as the shadows closed around me, rustling and low growls filling the misty night, I realized with painful clarity that the magnetic force that had brought us together had not shielded us, had not prevented betrayal of circumstance or separation forced by fate, and that I was left alone, trembling, exposed, and desperate, forced to confront the agony of watching him vanish into the chaos while I remained, heart pounding, mind racing, and the world seemed impossibly large, impossibly dangerous, and impossibly lonely because, for the first time, the bond one had clung to, the forbidden passion I had embraced, had collided with reality and fractured, leaving me shaken, uncertain, and aching with a pain that would not fade. That I stumbled through the forest, every step heavy with exhaustion, heart pounding, lungs burning, and the fog of despair pressed against me like a living thing, filling my mind with shadows of what I had lost, because he was gone. The magnetic figure who had consumed my every thought and stirred something deep in my blood was gone, torn from me by the chaos of the enemy, and the crushing weight of reality, and the clearing that had once been a place of fleeting passion and fragile trust now felt like a tomb, mist curling around tree trunks like fingers trying to hold me, to slow me, to trap me in the suffocating grip of fear, and my thoughts spiraled with what-ifs, every possible scenario playing across my mind in rapid succession, the scenarios that whispered of failure, loss, and the unbearable truth that I had been powerless to prevent the separation. And yet as I moved, clumsily, stumbling over roots and stones, the forest seemed alive with hidden eyes, unseen breath, silent observation, and I felt the weight of being hunted press against my back, a constant reminder that danger was never far, that enemies had only been delayed in their assault, that my vulnerability had been marked, and the pups, scattered and frightened, had vanished from my immediate vision, leaving me alone with the oppressive tension that threatened to crush my spirit. And I felt the magnetic pull, the tether that had once bound me to him, now a phantom ache stretching across the distance between us, reminding me that even in absence, desire and fate were inextricably linked, that he was out there, fighting, struggling, and that our bond had not been severed, only tested by fire. And as I pushed through the dense undergrowth, branches clawing at my skin, mist seeping into every sense, I realized that survival demanded clarity, that fear could not dictate my actions, that despair was a predator that could devour me faster than claws or fangs if I allowed it, and yet the hollow ache of loss made every decision agonizing, every breath a battle against the shadows pressing from within and without, and I came upon a clearing that I did not recognize, smaller, encased by jagged rocks and twisted roots. The sunlight filtered faintly through the mist, casting eerie patterns that danced across the ground, and I felt a shiver of recognition mixed with unease, because though unfamiliar, there was something in the arrangement of the stones, the subtle markings on the ground, that spoke to knowledge, to memory, to a message left for those who knew how to read it. And I fell to my knees, breath heaving, pulse racing, because in that moment I understood that despair could not dominate, that even alone, even hunted, even broken, I could find a thread to grasp, a way to move forward, a sign that the world had not abandoned me entirely. And as I traced the faint etchings in the dirt, symbols, half eroded but still discernible, I felt a spark ignite within, a whisper of understanding that connected to everything I had learned about my bloodline, the prophecy, the magnetic pull that had drawn me to him, and the danger that stalked us both. And I realized that even in separation, even in fear, there was guidance if I could interpret it, if I could summon courage, if I could overcome the paralyzing despair that threatened to root me to the ground. And a low wind stirred the mist, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a rhythm that resonated with the pull I had felt toward him, a reminder that even across distance and danger, our bond remained, a force that could not be erased by claws or shadows, a tether that whispered of reunion, of resilience, of the necessity to fight. And I felt the stirrings of determination rise within me, the first flicker of hope that I had not felt since he had been torn from my side. Because even in the darkest moment, even in the crushing weight of isolation and fear, there was a thread to follow, a message encoded in the forest, the mist, the symbols, a map of sorts, a clue that promised direction, guidance, and perhaps a way to reclaim what had been lost. And I traced the symbols with fingers trembling from fatigue and emotion, eyes wide, heart hammering, mind racing, trying to decipher meaning in curves and lines, recognizing fragments that mirrored what I had read in the ancient journals of my family, fragments that hinted at protective measures, pathways hidden to the untrained eye. And in that realization, I felt both awe and urgency, because knowledge alone was insufficient, action was required, courage was demanded, and yet the spark of hope, fragile but undeniable, had lit within me, igniting a resolve that perhaps I could survive this abyss, perhaps I could endure the absence, perhaps I could navigate the dangers that surrounded me. And in that same moment, a flicker of movement caught the corner of my eye, subtle, barely perceptible, a shadow that shifted differently than the trees, that moved with intent and awareness, and I froze, breath-hitching, muscles taut, because instinct screamed recognition, that the pull, the tether, the magnetic force that had defined our bond was responding even here, even now, even across the distance of fear and danger. And I realized with a thrill that it was more than memory, more than longing. It was alive, a force that could guide me, signal me, remind me that he was out there fighting, surviving, watching, waiting, and that we were not yet defeated, not yet separated beyond repair. And as my fingers lingered on the etched lines, tracing the path, absorbing the rhythm of the forest and the subtle vibrations that resonated with the pull in my blood, I felt a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and burgeoning determination, because I knew that the next steps were mine to take, that the abyss I had fallen into could become a passage, a trial that tested courage, strength, and will, and that even though the enemy was relentless, the shadows pressing, the forest oppressive, the magnetic figure who had become my anchor was not lost, that our bond remained, and that this faint spark, this cryptic clue hidden in the mist and etched stones, could guide me forward toward reunion, toward survival, and toward the confrontation I knew we could not avoid. And with that realization, shaky breath mingling with the mist, heart pounding, eyes scanning, muscles coiled for movement, I rose to my feet, trembling but resolute, knowing that the abyss had not claimed me entirely, that hope, fragile but alive, had emerged to guide me, and that even in the darkest, loneliest moment, I had a path to follow. The mist parted slowly as I navigated the forest with every nerve taut, muscles coiled, heart pounding, and then I saw him, a shadow at first blurred against the darkness, yet unmistakable, golden eyes flashing beneath the dim light, the magnetic figure who had consumed my thoughts, my dreams and my very heartbeat, and the sight of him, scarred and battle-worn yet alive, made my chest tighten with a tumult of relief, longing and lingering fear, because our separation had been brutal, a tearing of instinct, desire and trust, and even as I approached, the distance between us charged with the weight of unspoken words, danger and shared history, I could sense his caution, the subtle tension in the lines of his body, the flicker of suspicion in the way he held himself, and I realized with a jolt that our reunion, though inevitable, would not be simple, because scars ran deeper than flesh, and the magnetic pull that had drawn me to him now battled against mistrust, against fear of loss, against the possibility that one of us could falter again. And yet the connection was undeniable, a force that tugged at me, a gravity that could not be ignored, compelling me forward despite the ache of weeks spent apart, despite the threat of enemies still lurking, still hunting. And when our eyes met fully, locking across the clearing, I felt the tremor of recognition, of survival, of the bond we had forged through fire and shadow, and it was electric, making my knees weaken, my breath catch, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to us, the pup circling cautiously, ears pricked, sensing the tension, the history, the undeniable pull, and I wanted to close the distance, to collapse into him, to let instinct, desire, and the magnetic force reclaim me, but I hesitated because the weight of what had transpired, the separation, the danger, the betrayal of circumstance, loomed between us like a barrier, and I could see it mirrored in his eyes, the blend of relief, longing and mistrust that made my stomach twist with uncertainty, because love had never been simple, and ours was forged in extremes, in danger, in darkness, yet it was no less real, no less powerful, and I stepped forward cautiously, measuring every movement, sensing his readiness to react, to defend, to protect, to flee if needed, and the tension crackled, thick enough to taste, carrying every unspoken word, every ache, every desire we had suppressed, and when his voice finally broke the silence, low, deliberate, threaded with both warning and warmth, it made my heart catch because the tone held everything. Acknowledgement of the bond, recognition of the pain, the longing, the dangers we had faced, and a question unspoken but felt, whether we could bridge the distance that circumstance had imposed, whether we could trust again, whether we could allow ourselves to surrender to the force that had always existed between us, magnetic and relentless, pulling at the edges of reason, restraint and survival, and I felt the tension coiling tighter, tightening around my ribs, because instinct screamed at me to leap forward, to close the gap, to reassert the connection, and yet logic, tempered by weeks of fear and struggle, urged caution, observation, strategy, and I realized with a painful clarity that reunion was more than physical presence, more than a glance or a touch. It was a negotiation, a recalibration of trust, a test of our willingness to acknowledge the bond without letting vulnerability become weaponized by the enemy still lurking beyond the mist. And as I stepped closer, letting the faint breeze carry the scent of him to me, intoxicating, grounding, overwhelming, I noticed the subtle scars along his jaw, the tense set of his shoulders, the faint twitch of muscles ready to react, and I knew that our reunion was also a reflection of survival, of endurance, of the battles fought and the cost exacted, and it made the magnetic pull between us all the more potent, because danger had heightened every sense, every emotion, every desire, and I could feel it vibrating through my blood, coiling tight, igniting every nerve, and yet tempered by the knowledge that even in proximity, there was caution, and the wariness in his gaze mirrored my own, creating a tension so exquisite, so potent, that it made the air itself pulse with electric uncertainty, and when I finally extended my hand, a tentative bridge across the space, trembling slightly, I felt him hesitate, the fraction of a heartbeat stretched into eternity, because the past weeks had taught us both that trust was fragile, that attachment carried risk, that surrender could invite devastation, and yet he closed the gap slowly, deliberately, letting his hand cover mine, warmth meeting warmth, power meeting vulnerability, and I felt a surge of relief, of connection, of affirmation that despite the scars, Despite the mistrust, despite the danger, the bond remained magnetic and unyielding, and when our voices finally intertwined in whispered words, I felt the pull of intimacy, of recognition, of something sacred and dangerous in the same breath, and I realized that reunion was not merely physical but spiritual, emotional, elemental, a recognition of survival, desire, and destiny intertwined, and we moved closer, just enough to feel each other's presence fully, to acknowledge what had been suppressed, to breathe together in the charged space between longing and fear, and I saw in his eyes the reflection of my own turmoil, the mirrored ache, the undeniable acknowledgement that we had been pulled together not by choice alone but by forces older and stronger than either of us, and yet even in this closeness there was caution, a subtle understanding that one wrong step could undo the fragile equilibrium, that enemies still lurked, that danger had not relented, and that the bond, though magnetic, must be safeguarded with vigilance, and as we stood, hand in hand, breath mingling, muscles coiled, hearts hammering, I felt a flicker of clarity, a spark of purpose, that we could survive this, that we could navigate the peril and the attraction, that we could endure, but only if we acted as one. And then in a low, deliberate whisper, he spoke words that sealed the moment, a vow spoken just for me, a pact of secrecy and loyalty, a promise that no matter what shadows waited beyond the mist, no matter what enemies or dangers pressed against us, no matter the scars or the tests, we would face them together, tethered by the magnetic bond that had drawn us across chaos, fear, and time. And in that whispered vow, I felt a surge of hope, an unspoken agreement that the reunion was not merely a moment but a declaration, a commitment, and I mirrored the vow with my own promise, silent yet absolute, because the pull between us had endured everything and would endure whatever came next, binding us in shadow and light, in danger and desire. And as the mist curled around our entwined hands, I knew that even in the uncertainty, even in the scars and the fear, we were together again, bound by more than attraction, bound by survival, by choice, and by the magnetic inevitability of fate. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath as the shadows deepened, twisting and pooling with intent, and I could feel the magnetic pull between us humming stronger than ever, tethering me to him even as the realization settled with a cold clarity that the ultimate enemy, the predator who had orchestrated our separation, who had haunted every heartbeat, every step, every shadow of the past weeks, was finally emerging from the darkness, more cunning, more relentless, more dangerous than I could have imagined. And even as I tightened my grip on his hand, feeling the warmth, the familiar strength, the reassurance of his presence, my pulse raced, mind firing with every possible contingency, because the stakes had never been higher, because survival was no longer a choice but an imperative, because the bond we shared, magnetic, irresistible, and now tested beyond endurance, was intertwined with destiny, and destiny demanded that we face this, together, unflinching, unyielding. And yet the tension was almost unbearable, because the enemy had studied us, had watched, had learned, and every instinct screamed that nothing about this confrontation would be ordinary, that the forest itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, branches twisting like fingers, shadows coiling, whispers curling around the edges of my mind, teasing with threats and promises, and I felt him tighten his hold, golden eyes scanning, muscles coiled, alert and feral. And in that moment I knew that the pull between us was not just desire or attraction, it was survival, it was protection, it was a force older than fear, stronger than instinct, binding us in a way that neither time nor distance could sever. And yet the weight of what awaited pressed down, a looming sense of inevitability that made my stomach knot, because even as we stood, ready, poised like predators in our own right, I could feel the forest bending toward the unknown, the enemy gathering, preparing, and I knew that once the hunt began, nothing would be ordinary again, nothing would be safe, nothing would allow for hesitation, and my heart hammered not only with fear but with the undeniable pull of loyalty, love, and the magnetic bond that had carried me through every shadowed step, and I realized that this was what we had been building toward. Every glance, every stolen moment, every spark of passion and tension had led to this apex where survival, destiny, and love converged. And even as the fear prickled my skin, made my teeth clench and my muscles coil, I could not deny the thrill, the surge of adrenaline that came with the knowledge that we faced the ultimate test together. And in the midst of that tension, I felt the subtle, almost imperceptible reminder of our bond, the pull that had never faltered even when separation had seemed absolute, and I understood that it would guide us, anchor us, give us strength, and yet it was not enough on its own because the enemy was smart, ruthless, and merciless, and I had to steel myself, mind racing through plans, contingencies, strategies, and still the magnetic tension between us drew me closer to him, heart pounding, breath shallow, every nerve alive, because desire and danger were inextricably entwined, and I knew that succumbing even slightly to distraction could be fatal. Yet the pull of him, the reassurance of his presence, was a tether against panic, a lifeline against fear, and I let myself lean just enough into it, drawing courage, strength, and focus, and as the mist thickened around the clearing, as the shadows deepened into something sentient, I felt the first signs of movement, subtle but precise, the telltale ripple of the ultimate hunter closing in, and every hair on my body stood on end, every muscle ready to spring, every thought concentrated on survival and the bond that tethered me to him, and then the wind shifted, carrying sound, scent, and intent, and I knew that the enemy had positioned the first strike, that the trial we faced would not allow hesitation, compassion, or doubt, that only total commitment, strategy, and the magnetic connection between us could see us through, and I felt the surge of tension tighten around my chest, squeezing breath and heart alike, because this was no ordinary confrontation. This was destiny, testing loyalty, testing love, testing every decision we had made, every bond we had forged, every spark of passion, every thread of trust, and, as we moved forward cautiously, each step measured, each sense stretched to its limit, I felt the pull of the forest, the pull of the shadows, the pull of him, all coalescing into a singular force that demanded awareness, focus, and courage, and I realized that every instinct, every memory, every lesson of the past weeks had led me here, to the edge of chaos, to the brink of fear, to the precipice of what might be the final battle. And yet in that moment, even in the heat of anticipation, even in the crushing weight of potential loss, there was clarity, because I knew that the magnetic force between us, the bond that had survived separation, danger, and temptation, would be the fulcrum upon which our survival turned, and I felt it thrumming through my blood, calling me, guiding me, tethering me to him in ways no shadow, no claw, no predator could sever, and I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the electric pull of destiny coil through me, muscles tightening, senses on fire, eyes scanning the edges of the mist, aware of every rustle, every subtle shift, every glimmer that hinted at movement beyond my sight, and then he squeezed my hand, firm, grounding, a silent affirmation of partnership, of trust, of shared fate, and in that grip I found courage, found resolve, found the certainty that whatever awaited, we would face it together, tethered by desire, by loyalty, and by a bond that defied logic, fear, and even the claws of death. And as we stepped fully into the thickening mist, into the shadows that seemed to breathe with intent, into the unknown that awaited with teeth and malice, I felt the magnetic pull intensify, guiding me, warning me, compelling me forward, because the ultimate hunt had begun, and there was no turning back, no hesitation allowed, only the taut, unrelenting march toward the trial that would define everything, and I walked forward with him at my side, heart pounding, breath shallow, senses heightened, every fiber of my being alert, because what awaited us in the shadows would demand everything we had, and more, and I could only hope that our bond, our love, and the destiny that had brought us together would be enough to carry us through the storm. The shadows of the forest twisted and writhed like living things as we stepped deeper into the heart of the enemy's lair, every sense on fire, every nerve coiled like a spring, every sense on fire, every nerve coiled like a spring, and I could feel the magnetic pull between us thrumming through my blood, a tether of desire, trust, and destiny that anchored me even as terror clawed at my chest, because this was no ordinary fight. This was the convergence of everything we had endured, every secret, every stolen glance, every forbidden spark of attraction and trust, and the enemy waited, silent, patient, calculating, exuding a menace that made the hairs on my arms rise, and I could sense the anticipation of predators hidden in shadows, the whisper of claws against leaves, the subtle undulation of intent in the air, and I realized with a jolt that every instinct, every lesson, every bond we had forged was about to be tested to its absolute limit, and the first strike came without warning, a blur of movement, teeth and claws flashing, and we dove apart instinctively, golden eyes locking on mine, a silent surge of communication that spoke of protection, strategy, and shared resolve, and I moved with him as one, coiled and alert, each step measured, every muscle primed, and yet even in this orchestrated chaos, the magnetic pull between us was impossible to ignore, drawing me closer, igniting my blood, reminding me that desire and survival were not mutually exclusive, that our connection was both a weapon and a lifeline. And as the enemy lunged again, more precise, more ruthless, more deliberate than any instinct could predict, I felt the weight of every choice we had made pressing down on me, because failure now was not an abstract fear but a tangible, immediate threat. And the pups, huddled at the edge of the clearing, whined in fear, vulnerable and exposed, amplifying the urgency of our actions. And I realized that my fear for them, for him, and for myself had to be tempered by strategy, because emotional impulse alone could not save us. And as the clash escalated, golden eyes blazing, fangs bared, claws striking with preternatural speed, I felt the raw ferocity of the enemy as it collided with our combined strength. And yet even as we countered, parried, and struck, a part of me knew that this battle demanded more than mere physical skill, more than instinct, more than even the magnetic pull that bound us. It demanded sacrifice, courage beyond comprehension, and a willingness to risk everything, to face the darkest corners of fear. And I found myself propelled forward, heart hammering, blood roaring in my ears, as a shadow moved toward the pups with lethal precision. And without hesitation, I lunged, claws flashing, adrenaline surging, to intercept, and the impact jarred me, twisted my body, sent pain screaming through every joint. Yet I held firm, because instinct and love demanded protection. And as I met the enemy head-on, golden eyes and mine locking across the chaos, I felt the unspoken acknowledgement, the shared understanding that one of us had to take the risk, had to bear the burden, had to draw the focus of the ultimate predator. And I felt him surge beside me, a roar that split the night, feral, protective, magnetic, binding us together as one force against the chaos. And we moved with synchronicity, striking, dodging, weaving through the fog and shadows. As the battle escalated, and then came the moment that would define everything, a lunge aimed at me that would have torn my life from me if he had not intercepted with perfect precision, taking the brunt of the attack, claws raking through air, fangs flashing. And I realized with a jolt that he had risked himself for me. And the weight of that choice, that sacrifice, twisted my heart into a knot of fear, admiration, love, and an aching realization of how fragile everything was. And in that instant I had to act decisively, because hesitation now could mean death for him, for the pups, for us all. And I let the magnetic pull guide me, drawing on every ounce of skill, every spark of instinct, every lesson learned, striking with precision and force that felt almost beyond me. And the enemy staggered, faltered, a flicker of doubt in its eyes, and I seized the moment, heart hammering, claws and fangs moving in perfect timing with his, with the magnetic tether binding us. And the final strike landed, the enemy collapsing with a guttural roar that shook the trees, the forest exhaling a long tense sigh. As the danger ebbed, yet even in victory, there was no relief, only the thrum of adrenaline, the ache of exertion, the raw awareness of the cost, because he was hurt, the pups trembling, the forest scarred by the battle. And I knelt beside him, breath coming in ragged gasps, muscles trembling, eyes scanning every shadow, every whisper of movement, yet alive, still tethered to me, still magnetic, still my anchor. And I felt the weight of choice press on me, because even now I knew the battle had exacted a price, and the scars, the blood, the exhaustion would mark us, remind us of vulnerability, of mortality, of the fragility of love and survival intertwined. And yet in that same moment, I understood that we had endured, that the pull between us had carried us through, that loyalty, love, and destiny had converged to allow us to triumph. And as I brushed the mist from his fur, golden eyes locking with mine, I felt the magnetic bond, stronger now than ever, pulsing through me, a reminder that we had survived, that we had sacrificed, that we had chosen, and that destiny, though cruel, had not severed us. And as the clearing settled into quiet, the pups regrouped cautiously at our sides, and the forest exhaled, I realized that everything had changed, that we had faced the edge of fear, the pinnacle of danger, the most painful choices demanded by life and love, and yet we were still standing, tethered, bound, alive, transformed by the battle. And as I rose, brushing leaves and blood from my hands, I felt the undeniable shift, the magnetic bond thrumming like a living pulse, a tether to him, to the pups, to destiny itself. And I knew that the aftermath was both victory and reckoning, because nothing would ever be the same. We had survived, but we had paid a cost, and that cost would shape every step forward, every choice, every heartbeat, because we had crossed the edge of fear. And now the future, uncertain and magnetic, awaited us, pulling us toward the final chapter, toward resolution, toward the destiny we had fought to claim. The forest lay quiet after the storm, shadows stretching long in the pale light of dawn, and I moved among the remnants of the battle, blood and broken leaves underfoot, heart still pounding, muscles still trembling, and yet there was a strange calm in the air, a resonance that spoke of endings and beginnings intertwined, because we had survived the ultimate hunt, faced the edges of fear, danced with death and emerged. Changed irrevocably, each scar a testament, each heartbeat a reminder of what had been endured and what had been gained, and I looked to him, the magnetic figure who had been my anchor, my torment, my temptation, my strength, standing with golden eyes still blazing with the remnants of battle, fur marked with scars and dried blood, posture tense yet protective, and in that moment I understood fully that the bond we shared was no longer merely attraction, desire or instinct, it was elemental. Forged in fire and shadow, tested through terror and sacrifice, a force that had survived everything that could have torn it asunder. And yet in that realization, there was also mourning because we had paid the price, because lives had been touched, altered, and some could never be restored, because every step forward carried the echoes of what had been lost, and I felt the weight of that as a tangible ache in my chest, the pups circling warily at our feet, trembling but alive, a symbol of the fragile victories we had claimed. And I traced the memories of weeks, months, the moments of connection, the stolen glances, the whispers of longing and defiance, the magnetic pull that had guided me to him, that had drawn us together even when shadows and distance intervened, and I realized that our survival was not merely physical but spiritual, emotional, a reclamation of destiny that had been threatened at every turn, yet the price had been exacted in the form of scars, in the form of fear that would linger, in the form of knowledge that life was as cruel as it was beautiful. And I breathed in the dawn, mist curling around trees like ghosts of the past, carrying the memory of danger, passion, and resilience, and I saw in his eyes the reflection of everything we had endured, the same exhaustion, the same relief, the same magnetic acknowledgement that we had been shaped and altered by forces beyond comprehension, and yet despite that, despite the lingering ache of wounds and the weight of loss, there was a pulse of hope, fragile and steady, coursing between us, tethering us, affirming that survival had a meaning beyond mere endurance, that love, loyalty, and the bond we had forged could withstand even the darkest trials, and I reached for him, hand brushing his, the magnetic pull thrumming through me, a living echo of every choice, every risk, every heartbeat that had led us here, and in that contact, I felt the culmination of everything, the acceptance of scars and shadows, the acknowledgement that destiny had shaped us, challenged us, and yet we had emerged not merely intact but transformed, stronger, more aware, more attuned to the forces that had guided us, and as I gazed into his golden eyes, I saw the unspoken understanding, the silent vow, the magnetic confirmation that we had become more than ourselves through our trials, that our bond was eternal in the sense that it would linger through time, through challenge, through memory, because we had been forged in extremes, and extremes could not be undone, and yet there was also fragility, the recognition that life remained unpredictable, that danger could arise anew, that every heartbeat could carry both joy and loss, and I accepted that with the clarity that only those who have faced the edge of mortality can know, and as I surveyed the forest, the mist now lifting to reveal a quiet beauty, light filtering through shattered branches, illuminating the scattered signs of battle, the marks of survival, I felt the weight of reflection settle upon me, because I understood what had been gained. Love, trust, survival, insight, strength, and what had been lost. Innocence, certainty, the simplicity of a world untouched by shadows, and that balance, bitter and sweet, was the eternal echo that resonated in my chest, a haunting melody that would shape every choice to come, and I saw him kneel beside one of the pups, brushing fur gently, golden eyes softened by relief and lingering intensity, and in that small act, I recognized the culmination of everything. The magnetic bond had found its form in care, in protection, in acknowledgement of all that we had endured and survived, and I felt tears burn at the corners of my eyes, a mix of grief and gratitude, because the world had changed, we had changed, and yet we remained tethered, aligned, drawn inexorably together by forces older than fear, older than instinct, older than life itself, and I realized that in our survival, in our bond, in the enduring pull that had carried us across darkness and chaos, we had discovered something profound, truth that would linger in every heartbeat, in every whisper of wind through the trees, in every glance shared silently, that love and loyalty were not merely fleeting emotions but forces of nature, magnetic, eternal, capable of shaping destiny itself, and as the dawn strengthened, casting golden light across the clearing, illuminating scars, leaves, and fur alike, I felt the full resonance of what had been accomplished, what had been endured, and what had been lost and gained, and I saw in his eyes the same understanding, a mirror of my own realization, and without words we acknowledged that the bond we had survived the abyss to preserve was now its own entity, eternal, unbreakable, magnetic, yet tempered by the knowledge that life would always challenge us, that danger would always lurk at the edges, that the echoes of the past would forever linger in memory, scent, and shadow, and yet in that acceptance, in that mutual understanding, there was peace, a calm after the storm, a recognition that those scars would remain, though fear would always whisper in quiet moments, though destiny could demand more from us in the future. The magnetic bond, forged in shadow, struggle, and desire, had endured and would continue to endure, and as I took a step forward, he moving in tandem with me, we were no longer merely survivors or lovers or mates drawn by instinct. We were something more, a unit forged in extremes, tethered through destiny, tempered by sacrifice, and as the clearing opened before us, light spilling across moss, roots, and broken leaves, I felt the haunting echo settle in my chest, a pulse that would remain with me always, carrying memory, love, warning, and promise, and I knew that whatever awaited beyond this dawn, whatever paths destiny had yet to lay, whatever shadows might rise again, we had faced the edge, survived, and emerged tethered, bound, and eternal in a way that would linger, a resonance that would echo across every heartbeat, every whispered thought, every fleeting moment, leaving behind the indelible mark of everything we had been, everything we had lost, and everything we had found. And as the wind stirred, lifting mist and scenting the air with the remnants of night and battle, I felt his hand brush mine, a simple contact carrying the weight of triumph, loss, love, and destiny, and in that touch, I understood fully that some bonds once forged could never be broken, that echoes of survival, love, and sacrifice would reverberate through every moment yet to come, and I let myself stand fully, chest heaving, eyes scanning the horizon, heart tethered to his, soul intertwined, knowing that we had faced everything, lost what could not be saved, gained what could never be taken, and that in the magnetic, eternal echo of our bond, we had become immortal in memory, in love, in the lingering shadow of everything that had brought us to this dawn.